Tonight we drift across continents that no longer match their maps. You hear the soft shuffle of old parchment, the faint scratch of a quill that stopped centuries ago, and a whisper carried over steps so wide they make the stars seem small. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through the fog of memory, except it isn't yours. It belongs to something vast, half-remembered. A civilization whose traces scatter through mismatched ruins, ornate towers, and cryptic maps. People call it Tartaria, an empire whispered about in forgotten atlases and the conspiratorial corners of the internet. Some say it once stretched across Eurasia, from Siberia to Turkey, swallowing kingdoms whole in a silence so perfect even history forgot the echo. Mainstream historians, of course, roll their eyes. They remind you Tartary was a catch-all European term, the land of the Tartars, for regions barely explored by Western cartographers before the 18th century. It wasn't an empire, they say. Just a vast, misunderstood territory, a label slapped on everything east of Moscow and west of China when explorers ran out of certainty and patience. But you can't help noticing how many old maps show borders that shimmer differently, as though something once stood there that no one quite dared name. Picture this. The year is 1670. A Flemish mapmaker sits in Antwerp, his candle sputtering as he inks the word Tartaria in ornate loops over the top half of Asia. He's never been there. No one he knows has, but he's seen sketches from traders who swore they glimpsed cities of white stone rising from plains of ice. Great Tartary, he calls it, because greatness fits easier than ignorance. Centuries later, when those maps are digitized, you zoom in and squint at the delicate ink. It feels less like geography and more like a spell one cast to hold a civilization inside imagination's border. Some say that spell never broke. Here's where the fringe tidbit peeks through the curtain. Believers in the Lost Empire argue that Tartaria wasn't just a misunderstanding, but a global civilization wiped from memory by a coordinated cover-up. They speak of an event called the Mud Flood, a cataclysm that supposedly buried entire cities in one night. They point to photos of buildings with half-submerged windows and claim, "Look, the real ground level's below our feet." You glance at the screen, tilt your head, and admit those windows do look suspiciously low. Of course, the scholarly debate turns heated. One camp insists those buried floors are the result of urban reconstruction, centuries of street raising, foundation settling, or simple misinterpretation. The other camp waves sepia photographs like sacred texts. Somewhere in between, you float, suspended in the not knowing, where the best stories live. You imagine walking through one of those supposed Tartarian cities. The air smells of wet stone and brass. The streets are oddly proportioned, too wide for horse carts, yet too narrow for modern traffic. Lampposts sprout ornate coils, their tops shaped like stylized suns or lotus petals. Maybe they once carried etheric energy, as the theorists say, some form of lost technology that drew power from the air itself. Or maybe they were just really fancy gas lamps, designed by someone who liked a bit of flair. Either way, you feel the hum of craftsmanship that doesn't care what century it's in. Tartaria, as an idea, keeps mutating. In the 19th century, it meant those wild eastern lands. In the 21st century, it's become something stranger, a mirror reflecting our hunger for hidden knowledge. The story isn't about one lost empire, it's about the human need for grandeur that slips through history's fingers. If Atlantis belonged to the sea, Tartaria belongs to the sky, a myth built on clouds and scaffolding. But every myth begins with a seed of fact. Take the Tartar tribes of Central Asia, the Mongols, Tartars, and Turks, who did build empires, command armies, and construct monumental cities. Historians trace their lineage to powerful khanates that traded silk, gold, and gunpowder across vast distances. Their architectural legacy, fortresses in Samarkand, palaces in Bukhara, still glitters under desert sun. Maybe that's where the story began. Real grandeur blurred by distance, embellished by imagination, and finally renamed. Still, the architectural evidence taunts modern eyes. Buildings with Greco-Roman columns standing inexplicably in Siberian towns. Cathedrals with onion domes fused with Renaissance ornamentation. Who built these? A voice asks on a late-night documentary forum. The official answer, Russian imperial architects, 18th century, sounds plausible. But the unofficial one, the remnants of Tartaria, feels more romantic. And romance has a way of surviving logic. As you stroll mentally through this fog, another thought creeps in. Maybe Tartaria never vanished because it was never meant to be found. Myths like this exist not to reveal a lost truth, but to keep curiosity alive. They're cozy fires built in the cold hallways of history, flickering just enough to make you lean closer. The more you read, the more contradictions bloom. Old encyclopedias casually mention independent Tartary as if it were a known region, and 19th century maps divide it into provinces: Great, Chinese, and Little Tartary. Some scholars shrug, saying early geographers just recycled errors. Others suggest political motives. Labeling territories Tartary erased the nuanced identities of Turkic, Mongol, and Siberian peoples. After all, it's easier to rule or dismiss what you can lump under a single exotic name. And so, the Tartarian mystery deepens. Every time you think you've found the foundation stone, it sinks a little deeper into the mud. The official archives give you dates and dynasties, but the folk archives, YouTube videos, faded diaries, half-burned atlases, offer something more intoxicating. The sense that maybe, just maybe, the world once ran on rules we've forgotten. Imagine, for a moment, standing at the edge of a vast plain. Wind hisses through frozen reeds. Far ahead, a skyline of domes glints beneath an aurora. You squint, but the horizon won't hold still. It trembles like a mirage. That's Tartaria for you. Always there, but only if you don't look too hard. And before you drift off, you can't help smirking at one absurd thought. If Tartaria really had figured out free energy, advanced architecture, and continent-wide harmony, they must have had one heck of a maintenance crew. The moment you introduce humans, even the mythical kind, someone forgets to pay the utility bill. Still, you tuck that doubt beneath your pillow, because sometimes history isn't about proving what happened, it's about wondering what could have. And tonight, you're already halfway there, wandering through fog, following a faint glimmer that might be a lantern, or the reflection of your own curiosity. You step out of one fog-wrapped alley and into a plaza that refuses to obey the decades stamped on your mental calendar. It's paved in giant slabs, each the size of a living room rug, and the joints between them are filled with a mortar so fine it looks like liquid glass. A dome rises at the plaza's center, so perfectly hemispherical it confuses your sense of era. The dome's ribs catch the late light and cast a pattern across the square that makes your brain want to arrange historical styles like trading cards. Classical, Byzantine, neoclassical. None fit exactly, and that gap feels intentionally rude. A mainstream historian would tell you what those stones actually are: 18th and 19th century revival styles, fashionably eclectic public buildings built by imperial architects who loved to mix columns, domes, and decorative flourishes pulled from every museum catalogue. Cities in the Russian Empire and elsewhere were rebuilding rapidly after wars and fires, and sometimes they borrowed liberally from whatever was fashionable at the moment. That's the tidy explanation. The paperwork fits, the ledgers balance, and the architects kept journals with names you can pronounce after 2 drinks. You file that away like a receipt. But the fringe voice whispers differently. There are photographs sepia-toned, slightly blurred, showing buildings with windows half buried in earth, strange sublevels, and stairways that disappear into foundations. Folks on late-night forums point at these and say, "See? Whole floors got buried. Those domes belong to older, more advanced precincts now lost beneath newer streets." They call them cities that shouldn't exist because, in the official timeline, such architectural harmonies are improbable. How did a provincial trading post suddenly sprout a capital worthy of a coronation scene in an opera? You tilt your head, because that's what people do when a picture unsettles their timetable. You wander closer to the dome and run your hand along a carved frieze. The stone is cool and carries the faint scent of coal smoke and something older animal fat, maybe, used as a preservative in mortar. The relief shows figures in garments that could be ancient or theatrical costumes from an 18th century play. A scholar might point out the sculptor's technique. The chisel marks align with known workshops that trained artisans sent north during imperial building campaigns. An enthusiast will counter with a flourish about lost guilds and itinerant masons carrying secret joinery methods across continents. Both are right about something and wrong about other things. And you enjoy the argument as you would enjoy a radio play. Touch feels dangerous here. In the way that touching a bruise is, it makes you complicit in deciding an answer the evidence won't hand over. You crouch and peer into a narrow window set low in the plaza wall. Inside, a vaulted corridor runs deep, its floor layered in silt and dust that looks disturbingly recent. For a second, your imagination supplies an easy narrative. A sudden flood, or a revolution, or a scheduled demolition that never completed. But the image of whole districts being erased overnight, of streets swallowed by a single catastrophe, sounds theatrical and delicious. The kind of explanation people prefer because it spares them the tedious work of archival research. A quirky tidbit floats by. Some enthusiasts catalogue buildings with what they call anomalous masonry stones cut in interlocking patterns that, unlike typical mortarwork, appear to fit together like puzzle pieces so tight you can't wedge a blade between them. They show photos of corners where mortar is absent and yet the wall holds perfectly. Engineers smile politely and explain thermal expansion and skilled stonemasonry. Conspiracy fans gurgle with delight and imagine unknown technologies, vibrational cutters, lost alloys, or ancient superglue. You laugh softly because the picture of an 18th century mason with a superglue bottle is so absurd it almost makes sense. There's a subtle theatre to these places. Columns that start thinner than your forearm and swell into relief as they rise. Capitals carved with botanical motifs that don't exist in the local flora. You stand under an arch and realize the acoustics favor a whispered conversation from the far side. Voices bounce and bloom in ways that suggest the space was designed for ritual murmurs or official proclamation. Maybe it was. Maybe someone decided, 200 years ago, that dramatic echo makes a bureaucratic toast sound like prophecy. The ambiguity is delicious and mildly infuriating. Like ordering soup and getting broth with memories. You find graffiti layered like strata dates and names scribbled over older dates and names. A faded 1892 signature, then a line scratched through it and another name from 1924, and beneath both, a charred symbol you can't quite decipher. Time in these walls is not linear, it's a palimpsest. Later builders raised floors, covered basements, and repurposed colonnades as their needs demanded. Doors that once opened onto market stalls now peer down from second-story walkways, awkward, polite, resigned. That practical habit of reusing space explains a lot of the apparent oddities. You can salvage marble, bricks, even entire facades if you know what you're doing, and have no shame about architectural patchwork. Still, you like the romantic possibility more than the plausible one. It's smaller and warmer comfort food for a restless mind. You imagine an imperial council deciding to conceal an entire archive. Build atop it. Let the street do the rest. And the street, as streets do, cooperates. It accumulates debris, market litter, and layers of cobbled replacement. Over time, what was once subterranean becomes subterranean in name only. Future generations forget the original ground plane. It's human forgetfulness, dressed up as inevitability. There are also oddly modern artifacts wedged in older fabric, an iron bolt, stamped with an industrial manufacturer's symbol, shoved into a masonry seam, a fragment of glass that bears bubbles consistent with 19th century glassmaking. These intrusions suggest a different story. Constant remodeling, material reuse, and the eagerness of later builders to salvage whatever they could. Yet fringe commentators prefer to call them retrofits from a global network, implying a coordinated reuse across distant cities. The language is theatrical. The idea of a postal system for building parts sounds like cosplay for urban planners. You follow a narrow lane that takes you to a square where a clock tower leans like a tired sentry. Its face is cracked, numerals half erased, and the hands have frozen at an indeterminate hour. People have proposed charming explanations. The clock stopped during a war. A local patriot smashed the hands in protest. The more imaginative say the clock froze at the moment of the mud flood, an event that supposedly halted civic time across a continent. You smile at that image, an entire region suspended at tea time forever, and taste the absurdity like sugar on the tongue. Still, the allure lies in the dissonance. Why does a provincial town have a triumphal arch that borrows from Roman vocabulary? Why do columns mimic Corinthian curls in a place where only wooden beams were common a century earlier? The evidence hinting at cultural diffusion is solid. The Silk Road moved goods and styles, and imperial architects often staged spectacles to impress local elites. Yet you can feel the pull of an alternative narrative, a lost network of knowledge-sharing plans, craftsmen, and perhaps even prefabricated parts that migrated like birds. Inside a half-restored bathhouse, tiled mosaics shimmer despite years of neglect. The tiles depict waves, fish, and musicians playing instruments you almost recognize but can't name. A historian would use this as proof of cultural continuity, shared motifs crossing borders. A fringe narrator will say, "Tiles? Yes, but the plumbing's sophistication indicates engineering far beyond the supposed era. Look at the lead pipes carved to fit precisely under vaulted floors. Engineers show diagrams of Roman aqueducts and Ottoman hammams and calmly hand both sides a diagram with arrows. The argument devolves into friendly rivalry. Who can be more charitable to the past's competence? Through it all, the plaza's dome watches like a patient animal, indifferent to arguments. Pigeons claim reproductive rights on its cornices. Street vendors sell warm bread and cigarettes to late-shift workers. Children chase each other through colonnades whose capitals still hold traces of gold leaf. The mundane life around these anomalies is the most persuasive evidence against grand conspiracies. People live, work, and forget in utterly ordinary ways. You almost admire history's ability to be both dramatic and dull at the same time. There's an open scholarly debate that nags at the back of every guidebook. Are these anomalous structures the result of continuous local architectural evolution, or the remnants of an older, organized civilization whose technology and influence have been underplayed in official narratives? Scholars who favor the first point to documentation, tax records, and architectural plans. Those who suspect otherwise point to stylistic anomalies and material oddities. The debate has warmed blogs, lecture halls, and late-night panels, and it has the polite fury of people who love both evidence and mystery. You stand on the plaza and let the contradictions sit in your chest like a small stone. The rational explanations are convincing, the romantic ones are irresistible. In the end, both may be true in part. Maybe craftsmen moved, styles migrated, and cities rebuilt themselves layer by layer, while at the same time, there were pockets of extraordinary ingenuity that standard textbooks underplay. The city that shouldn't exist becomes, rather, a city that refuses to be simplified. As you turn to leave, a child scampers past with a toy that's a small, meticulously carved model of the very dome you just admired. It's painted in chipped blues and greens, and the child carries it like a relic. You realize then that what matters isn't proving ownership of this architecture exactly, but noticing how people continue to repurpose, remember, and play with these monuments. The monuments become part of new stories, not static museum pieces. They are alive. You step back into the lane, the dome shrinking in the distance, and a little thrill rides along your spine, the kind you get when you almost understand something, then realize you prefer the mystery. For tonight, at least, the city keeps its secrets, which is good because some secrets make better companions than answers. You leave behind the domes and arches, following a dirt road that seems to have forgotten whether it's supposed to be ancient or newly paved. On your left, a low ridge rises, littered with stones that look suspiciously deliberate. Not random scatter, more like alignment. Someone, long ago, had a geometry problem and decided to solve it on a continental scale. That's how the theory of the Great Grid begins. A whispered claim that the Tartarian Empire once organized its cities, fortresses, and monuments along invisible lines that stretch around the planet, forming a web of power and precision. You look down at your own shadow and imagine it stretched across longitude and latitude, tied to something vast. You could dismiss it. Of course, geomancy has been humanity's favorite pastime since someone first noticed that temples and sunsets occasionally line up. But you decide to entertain it for a while, if only because patterns make good lullabies. The mainstream historical fact goes like this. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European and Russian cartographers were perfecting global coordinate systems. Triangulation networks spanned from Paris to Peking, using observation towers and baselines marked by stone obelisks. The alignment of cities often followed rivers, trade routes, or simple practicality. Yet even then, Certain monuments, cathedrals in Kazan, towers in Samarkand, fortresses near Tobolsk seem to share uncanny positional symmetry. Coincidence? Possibly, but the numbers have a way of smirking at you when you measure too carefully. A fringe tidbit adds spice. Some enthusiasts claim these alignments are evidence of a prehistoric energy grid, nodes of telluric current, where the Earth itself hums with electromagnetic resonance. According to them, Tartarian architects didn't just build cities, they tuned them. The domes and spires you admired earlier, antennas, the plazas and canals, capacitors, and that golden dome you touched last section, sure, maybe a work of art, but possibly also a power collector, feeding some now-lost etheric network. You're half tempted to imagine ancient engineers with tuning forks, humming softly to calibrate their empire. Scholars shake their heads. They prefer Occam's razor architects followed topography and symmetry because humans like order. The Earth's curve is a convenient coincidence. Still, even skeptics admit that there's a strange satisfaction in overlaying world maps and discovering improbable alignments. The human brain loves patterns so much it will happily invent them. You chuckle. If you trace enough lines on Google Earth, even your local bakery aligns with the Great Pyramid eventually. You crest a small hill, and the wind carries a low hum, perhaps wires, perhaps imagination. You squint toward the horizon. In the distance, slender towers poke through haze. Perfectly spaced, they might be communication masts, or grain silos, or ghosts. In the dimming light, they line up neatly enough to make your heartbeat syncopate with geography. You take another step, and the alignment collapses. But for one delicious second, you almost believe the Earth was speaking in straight lines. There's a mainstream debate here worth pausing over. Archaeogeographers note that many civilizations, Egyptian, Incan, Chinese, built monuments with astronomical precision. Aligning structures with solstices and stars wasn't mystical. It was practical timekeeping. If Tartaria existed, and if its engineers shared that universal obsession with celestial order, then some alignments might indeed be intentional. What's uncertain is scale. Were they designing cities for cosmic resonance, or simply following the sunrise because dawn looks dramatic against domes? The air cools as you descend into a valley. You find the remains of an old canal, dried and cracked, cutting through fields. It runs arrow straight for miles, ignoring hills and reason. Modern engineers marvel at such stubborn geometry it's hard enough to dig a swimming pool level, let alone a canal across wilderness. Historians attribute this to imperial ambition. Rulers loved straight lines. They screamed control. Tartaria's believers, however, point at canals like this and whisper about lost surveying tools, laser-like accuracy, and knowledge of magnetism centuries ahead of schedule. A local farmer, fictional, but probably real enough, leans on his shovel and tells you a story passed from his grandfather. They say the canal followed a singing stone, he mutters, eyes narrowing. Every mile, the builders placed one stone that hummed when you struck it with iron. They lined them up until the song stopped. You ask if he's ever heard it himself. He smiles, tooth missing. Only when I was young and half asleep. That's good enough. Half asleep is the best state for myth hunting anyway. At the canal's midpoint, a cluster of granite pillars rises like tuning forks. Their surfaces are smooth, too smooth, you think, for something allegedly abandoned. The official plaque identifies them as 19th century surveying markers erected during the expansion of trade routes. A QR code points to a municipal heritage site. You scan it, of course you do, and the page loads a dry description. Constructed under the supervision of Russian imperial engineers, circa 1,830 seconds. But your eyes drift from text to texture. The granite glimmers faintly, as if it remembers something electric. You imagine energy pulsing beneath, connecting pillar to pillar, forming a circuit across continents. Maybe once the Empire breathed through these stones, like lungs of granite. Time for a light joke before your imagination catches fire. If this grid really did carry global energy, someone must have been in charge of the utility bills. Picture an ancient Tartarian accountant squinting at receipts, muttering, Who left the dome running overnight again? Bureaucracy, you suspect, is the one constant across all timelines. Modern researchers who toy with the grid idea often fall into two camps. The cultural diffusionists argue that similar designs across Eurasia stem from shared trade routes and the exchange of architectural manuals. The geomantic theorists go further, claiming an ancient world-spanning civilization predated known history, with Tartaria as its last remnant. Between them lies the scientific grey zone, where archaeologists cautiously test magnetic anomalies around old ruins, not because they expect free energy, but because unusual soil composition sometimes hides iron deposits or even meteor fragments. Every anomaly breeds another story. As night settles, stars emerge one by one. You notice how the brightest seem to hang precisely above distant hills. Your rational mind whispers coincidence, but your sleepy one feels alignment. Maybe every civilization projects its geometry onto the heavens because the stars are the only architects who never lose their blueprints. You wonder if ancient Tartarians, real or imagined, stood under the same constellations, tracing invisible lattices between them and the earth below, believing themselves custodians of a cosmic grid. Then comes the sound, a low vibration, faint but insistent, as if the landscape is tuning itself. You hold your breath. It's probably wind, maybe wires singing under tension, but you let the illusion linger. You imagine entire cities resonating in harmony, towers acting like organ pipes, domes amplifying the Earth's magnetic sigh. The air smells faintly metallic, and the hairs on your arms lift, betraying your nervous electricity. A scholarly debate surfaces again. Could geomagnetic sensitivity have influenced ancient architecture? Some studies suggest humans subconsciously align structures along magnetic north, responding to subtle cues. Others scoff humans follow rivers, not magnetic fields. Yet across old continents, similar orientations persist. Whether coincidence or cosmic intuition, it makes for good storytelling. And tonight, that's the currency we're trading. You walk along the canal until it disappears into darkness. Each step crunches on gravel that once carried carts, then trains, then nothing. Above you, stars flicker like old bulbs, and you can't tell if they're watching or winking. The night grows cooler, and your thoughts slow to the rhythm of the unseen lines that might or might not span the earth. Before you leave, you glance back at the ridge where this all began. From here, the landscape looks ordinary again. No perfect alignments, no humming stones, just wind and weeds. Yet somewhere inside you, a map unrolls a faint network connecting all the places you've visited and all the mysteries still waiting. Whether those lines exist in stone or only in your imagination doesn't matter. The grid is real enough if you can feel it. You smile, half amused. If the great grid truly does hum beneath the soil, it's probably humming a lullaby right now, soft, steady, older than maps. You close your eyes for a moment, listening. Somewhere between science and superstition, you swear you hear it. The earth, exhaling through forgotten architecture, gently reminding you that even the most mysterious empires leave patterns in their sleep. The night deepens as you follow the dried canal's edge toward a cluster of silhouettes that look almost theatrical in the half-light. Towers taper like candles half melted. Arches lean inward as if whispering secrets. And underfoot, you find chips of marble that glint like bits of moon. You've entered the realm of the builders, the supposed masters of mud and marble, whose work feels both accidental and deliberate, like an orchestra that never stopped playing even after the audience left. The air smells faintly of lime dust and rain on stone. Somewhere nearby, a hammer strikes metal with rhythmic patience. You picture yourself drifting through a construction site that has been running for 300 years, each generation picking up the chisel where the last left off. Mainstream history says the builders were craftsmen, masons, artisans, engineers working under imperial patronage in the 17th to 19th centuries. They had names, guilds, apprenticeships, and most importantly, pay stubs. Across Eurasia, the combination of local tradition and imported European design created what historians call eclectic classicism. The result, a flood of domes, arches, and colonnades that seemed to appear overnight, yet were meticulously planned. You nod. Paperwork and blueprints do have their own kind of beauty, and yet the mythos insists there was something more. According to Tartarian enthusiasts, these builders didn't just stack stones, they commanded elements. The masters of mud, as they're sometimes called, allegedly used liquefied earth mixed with alchemical compounds, poured into molds to form seamless stone-like blocks. The evidence? Walls without mortar lines, buildings whose cornerstones appear fused, as if they were cast in one piece. You crouch beside one such wall now, tracing the surface with your fingertips. It feels unnaturally smooth, even at the seams. A geologist might explain that some ancient builders used geopolymer techniques, essentially early cement mixtures, to bond stones together. The formula? Still debated. A fringe voice online insists modern concrete is a pale imitation of Tartarian stone, capable of self-healing in humidity. You laugh softly. Self-healing walls sound wonderful until they start closing your windows by themselves. There's a scholarly debate buried beneath the memes. Did pre-industrial engineers actually master forms of concrete now lost? Archaeologists point to Roman cement, which can indeed recrystallize when exposed to water, prolonging its life for millennia. If Rome managed that, why not another civilization, one whose records didn't survive translation or conquest? You brush away dust and find a symbol carved into the lintel, an interlocking knot. Simple, yet hypnotic. Historians classify it as a decorative motif common across Central Asia. Fringe researchers see blueprints encoded in art schematics for vibration frequencies. Some say, or diagrams for sound-based levitation. You roll your eyes, then imagine a builder humming at the correct pitch, and a 2-ton block floating gently into place. The image is ridiculous and strangely comforting. A light joke rises to your lips. Maybe that's why so many of these buildings seem to have perfect acoustics. They were tuned by singing masons. Choir practice and construction rolled into one. You'd pay to watch that. You wander deeper into the ruins, or are they restorations, where scaffolding still clings to stone like cobwebs of ambition? Every pillar tells a story of impossible patience. Some are fluted, others twisted, as if someone tried every design in the textbook and decided to keep them all. You imagine the foreman, centuries ago, squinting at blueprints the size of bedsheets and muttering, "We'll figure it out on the scaffolding." The mainstream narrative gives credit to migration. After the fall of Byzantium, artisans fled eastward, bringing masonry and tile techniques to new patrons. Later, Russian imperial workshops borrowed these ideas and adapted them to cold climates. The mix created buildings that felt older than they were. In other words, there's no lost civilization required, just global craftsmanship, fueled by trade and curiosity. But myth refuses to sit quietly under rationality. You picture secret lodges of Tartarian architects meeting by candlelight, not to discuss payroll, but the metaphysics of load-bearing. Maybe they saw architecture as a conversation with the planet, a way of tuning the Earth's resonance to human comfort. There's a tenderness to that thought, like the idea that buildings might hum lullabies to their inhabitants. You find a half-collapsed dome nearby. Inside, ivy trails through shattered glass, and a breeze hums faintly in the hollow. The acoustics are perfect, one whisper echoes like a choir. You can't help yourself. You whisper the word, "Hello," and the dome answers with a soft, elongated low, as though the place remembers voices. Maybe it does. The quirky tidbit of the evening arrives courtesy of an old travel diary found in a dusty library in Kazan. The author, a merchant named Vasily Trofimov, wrote in 1817 that he visited a factory of architecture where workers poured liquid marble into wooden forms. He describes pillars cast whole, polished within days. Historians dismiss it as poetic exaggeration. Still, you can't unsee it. Factories of architecture, imagine the phrase glowing on a neon sign. According to fringe reconstructions, Tartarian workshops operated like modern prefabrication plants. Components were molded off-site and assembled swiftly, explaining the empire's alleged ability to rebuild cities in years, not decades. Skeptics counter that such efficiency sounds like an industrial fairy tale. Yet, industrialization itself was a kind of magic: steam engines, cranes, and hydraulic presses turning human labor into symphonies of precision. Somewhere between miracle and machinery lies the truth. As you walk, the path slopes toward an open quarry, an amphitheater of silence. Massive blocks lie half-cut, their surfaces marked by chisel grooves that taper to nothing. Tools rust nearby, fossilized in mud. You imagine the builders leaving one evening, intending to return after supper, and simply not. Maybe the empire collapsed overnight, or maybe the pay ran out. Both explanations feel tragically human. Another scholarly debate simmers. Were such unfinished quarries evidence of sudden catastrophe or ordinary economics? Empires run on budgets, and budgets falter. A flood, a war, a change in patronage. Any of these can halt construction mid-chisel. Yet the romantic mind insists on drama. The sudden silencing of hammers, the echo that never fades. Night gathers fully now, and torches flicker along the ridge where restoration crews have set up camp. You hear the metallic clank of scaffolding, the drone of generators, the smell of diesel mixing with ancient dust. The modern and mythical coexist here with surprising ease, fluorescent lights illuminating mysteries older than recorded speech. A worker passes you, nods politely, and goes back to spraying a protective coating on marble. You almost want to ask if he feels like a reincarnated mason, continuing the work of vanished masters. You tilt your gaze upward. Stars gleam through the broken dome, forming constellations that look suspiciously like blueprints. The great grid from earlier still tugs at your imagination. Maybe these master builders were part of it, a brotherhood of geometry spanning continents, building in alignment with unseen harmonics. The notion sounds absurd and thrilling in equal measure, like a bedtime story told by someone who insists they don't believe in ghosts but always leaves a light on. As you trace your way out of the quarry, you think of how every civilization leaves behind two legacies: the structures themselves and the longing of future generations to understand them. The stones can be measured, but the longing that's infinite. Maybe the real mastery of these builders wasn't just technical skill, but their ability to design buildings that outlast certainty. One last thought before you move on. If these were the masters of mud and marble, perhaps they knew something we've forgotten, that permanence doesn't come from steel or concrete, but from mystery. A building you can't quite explain will always seem alive. You exhale, watching the dust swirl in your flashlight beam, and the ruins seem to breathe back. You follow the sound of running water now, faint at first, like a dream half remembered. The air turns damp and cool, and a light mist drifts in from somewhere unseen. It smells faintly metallic, tinged with moss and ozone. You've reached what the old maps call the City of Currents, once the hydraulic heart of Tartaria, or so the whispers go. They say the builders didn't just master architecture, they tamed the flow of nature itself. The canals here weren't just for transport, they powered something. Mills? Turbines? Entire cities humming on invisible energy. You stand at the edge of a cracked aqueduct and listen. The stone beneath your boots is carved with concentric rings, a pattern that looks more like circuitry than ornamentation. Mainstream historians point to practicality. Ancient irrigation, flood control, maybe heating systems powered by water pressure. Perfectly sensible. After all, Central Asia has a long history of engineering brilliance. The qanats of Persia, the water wheels of Samarkand, the bathhouses of Bukhara. But the Tartarian mythos takes this further, suggesting that water itself was their power source literally, not just for cleaning or cooling, but as a medium of electrical flow, an ancient and natural generator. You lean over the aqueduct's lip and imagine streams of crystal water gushing through bronze-lined channels, crackling faintly with blue light. The sound alone would be hypnotic, a constant lullaby of movement, like the Empire's heartbeat echoing beneath every city. Maybe that's what kept Tartaria alive so long. A rhythm, not a regime. A quirky tidbit bubbles up from your mental archive. In 1792, a French traveller named Claude Lenoir recorded seeing wells that sang in the lands east of the Caspian. He described narrow shafts that emitted tones when wind passed over them, as if the earth itself were an organ. Scholars dismiss it as a poetic flourish, but acoustics experts have since proven that certain carved shafts can indeed resonate, producing tones if air pressure changes. Natural wind harps hidden in the ground, practical or mystical, depends on who's funding your research. You walk further, following a channel that slopes into darkness. The walls are smooth, almost glassy, and every few meters a bronze pipe juts out, green with age. One still drips. You dip a finger into the water, it's cold enough to sting. For a moment, you imagine the builders laughing, watching you puzzle over plumbing that hasn't flowed in centuries. Maybe it's not broken. Maybe it's waiting. one mainstream fact stands unshakable. Hydraulic engineering was one of the great triumphs of ancient societies. The Romans had aqueducts, the Chinese built massive canal systems, and Islamic architects perfected pressure-driven fountains. It's entirely plausible that Tartaria, if we strip away the legend, was just another participant in humanity's long affair with water. What makes the story strange is scale. Some ruins attributed to Tartaria feature water channels hundreds of kilometers apart, yet perfectly level, as if measured with lasers. That, scholars admit, is odd. Even with surveying tools, maintaining such gradient precision is nearly impossible. A debate continues: were those measurements lucky accidents or evidence of advanced surveying? A few daring academics have floated the idea of magnetic alignment, ancient engineers using the Earth's field to maintain straightness across distance. Fringe theorists grin at that. They call it proof that Tartaria harnessed telluric energy, currents flowing through the ground itself. You can almost hear the word Tesla whispered across centuries. A breeze picks up, rustling the reeds. You crack a smile. Maybe Tartaria's power grid wasn't lost, just unplugged. The path leads you into a half-buried chamber. The ceiling arches low, supported by carved ribs that resemble the inside of a giant seashell. In the center, a circular basin glows faintly blue, not magic, just reflection from your flashlight. But for a moment, it feels alive. You kneel, run your palm through the still water, and a ripple distorts your reflection until your face looks like someone else's. Maybe one of those builders. Checking in on their handiwork, a light joke sneaks out before you can stop it. Mirror, mirror, in the well did Tartaria do it, or was it just good plumbing? The echo answers with a perfect hollow. You notice inscriptions along the rim, faint and almost playful. Spirals, arrows, something like wave patterns. A scholar might call them decorative hydrodynamics, art imitating function, but a few conspiracy forums insist they're instructions, the flow codes of Tartarian water systems. Some amateur researchers even built replicas, claiming to have generated electric sparks using only moving water and copper. Mainstream engineers shrug, it's just static discharge. Still, static has to come from somewhere, doesn't it? You lean back, listening to droplets fall from the ceiling. Each one lands with a crisp plink, spaced so evenly it feels mechanical. Your eyelids grow heavy, lulled by the rhythm. Maybe that's why this empire feels so haunting. It wasn't just built, it was composed. Every aqueduct, every tower, tuned to the same invisible tempo. There's another scholarly debate worth mentioning: the legend of the hydro temples. In fringe literature, these were said to be enormous stone complexes where priests or engineers, depending on your translation, performed rituals to regulate the empire's energy. Archaeologists, of course, see only bathhouses and cisterns. Yet when they measure those sites, they often find something peculiar: residual magnetism in the stone itself, far higher than surrounding areas. Is that due to mineral content, or perhaps to centuries of water flow aligning magnetic domains? The line between science and mysticism thins until you can't quite tell where one ends. A quirky story circulates among modern restorers. When they drained one of these ancient cisterns in Astrakhan, the pumps kept shorting out. Electric shocks rippled through the muddy water. Though no source could be found, the foreman reportedly laughed it off, Tartarian ghosts playing with the fuses. But you can't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, the old system wasn't as dead as they thought. You imagine walking through this city in its prime, steam curling from fountains, gears humming beneath bridges, the scent of ozone on every breeze. People filling amphitheaters lit not by torches but by softly glowing globes of blue-white light electroluminescence powered by flowing water. It sounds absurd. It sounds beautiful. You wish it were true. Then again, maybe it doesn't have to be. Maybe what makes the myth endure is how it mirrors our own longing to believe that once, long ago, humans built things that worked in harmony with nature rather than against it. The Tartarian water cities become metaphors for balance, for elegance, for the hope that technology can be gentle. The mist thickens as you climb back into open air. A river glides silently through the valley, moonlight rippling over its surface like mercury. You picture invisible conduits beneath. A whole ghost network still pulsing faintly. Somewhere far away, Maybe another forgotten basin hums in sympathy. As you rest beside the flow, the night wraps around you like cool silk. A bat skims the surface of the water, catching invisible insects. Ripples spread, merge, vanish. You realize how effortlessly the natural and the engineered coexist here. As if the builders never saw a difference. You close your eyes and imagine being one of them. Standing knee-deep in a canal, hammering bronze fittings while stars wheel above. The water splashes, time slides by, and you hum along with the current, building something that feels alive. You wake, or perhaps you never truly slept, to the steady rhythm of hoofbeats echoing along stone. A pale dawn is rising over the steppe, painting everything in faint gold. Ahead, banners flutter like lazy tongues of fire above a walled citadel. You've wandered into what locals call the Palace of Echoes, the heart of Tartarian rule. If such a heart ever existed, the empire's rulers, according to the most formal sources, were administrators of vast territories stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific coast. The Russian chronicles name khans, princes, and governors, each recorded neatly on paper, complete with seals and family crests. But the Tartarian story insists there were other leaders, mysterious, half-remembered figures who ruled not from thrones but from observation towers, watching the world through lenses of crystal and brass. You approach the palace gate. The stone doors are so enormous that they seem less like an entrance and more like a statement. Yes, we were here. The hinges still intact after centuries whisper as the wind moves through them, producing a low, mournful hum. The courtyard within is a maze of colonnades and reflecting pools, each one perfectly symmetrical, perfectly unnecessary. A mainstream historian might say symmetry symbolized divine order, that the rulers of Tartaria, like so many monarchs, used geometry as propaganda. If the buildings looked perfect, perhaps the government did too. But there's another interpretation, one favored by the dreamers and night scholars, that the architecture wasn't just for show. It was part of a network, palaces arranged like nodes in a vast geometric map. You trace one pattern on the paving stones, 8 pointed stars intersected by circles. A fringe researcher once suggested that these courtyards formed harmonic amplifiers, that the palaces themselves could channel energy, like architectural batteries. It sounds wild, but it's not without precedent. Ancient temples around the world often display alignments that enhance sound or electromagnetic resonance. Coincidence? Or forgotten technology wrapped in ritual? You imagine one of the emperors, or whatever title they preferred, standing in this courtyard centuries ago, cloaked in gold-threaded silk, face calm, eyes bright. Around them, scholars murmur calculations. Artists paint in pigments ground from lapis, and engineers adjust mirrored discs to reflect the sun into underground chambers. It's a cinematic image, sure, but somehow it fits. The mainstream record gives us names like Emperor Tartarus or Khan Tamerlane, powerful figures who built empires through war and law, but none of them quite fit the tone of the myth. The Tartarian leaders of legend were philosopher kings, blending science, spirituality, and architecture into governance. Think less Julius Caesar, more Nikola Tesla in royal robes. A light joke stirs at your lips. You picture a royal decree that reads, "Henceforth, citizens must maintain proper vibration frequency during meditation hour, or face mild disapproval." Bureaucracy meets mysticism, what a combo. Still, the debate among scholars is real. Some fringe historians argue that early descriptions of Tartarian rulers were mistranslated. Words like architect and astronomer were later rendered as king and general. That subtle shift turned a guild of engineers into a dynasty of monarchs. It's possible, they claim, that the emperor was never a person at all, but a title for whoever managed the network of knowledge. You stroll through a hall lined with mirrors tarnished to bronze. Each one warps your reflection until it looks ancient, regal, and oddly tired. The palace smells faintly of oil and cinnamon, as if the air itself remembers rituals of preservation. At the far end, a dais holds a throne of translucent stone, too smooth to be marble, too heavy to be quartz. You run your fingers along its armrest. It's warm, impossibly. Perhaps the sunlight just caught it, but your imagination insists otherwise. Mainstream fact. In certain regions of Siberia and Mongolia, rulers indeed sat on stone thrones, carved from single blocks of jade or soapstone. These were not just decorative, they symbolized stability, immovability, a kind of geological authority. But some modern excavations have found traces of metal filings embedded in those seats, as if the stones once carried current. Geologists call it contamination. Myth lovers call it circuitry. Another debate: the mysterious lumen halls described in 18th century travel journals. Visitors claim to have seen underground chambers lit by glowing panels, no smoke, no flame. A miracle or a mistranslation of phosphorescent minerals? The jury remains out, but the idea of a softly glowing palace lingers beautifully in the mind. You wander through a side corridor where sunlight filters through fractured glass, painting the floor in shifting mosaics. The silence feels deliberate, like an instrument waiting for its cue. You picture council meetings here, rulers discussing philosophy instead of conquest, or perhaps both at once. Maybe they believed governance wasn't about laws, but frequencies tuning society like an orchestra. A quirky anecdote from a 19th century archaeologist comes to mind. He claimed to have found an inscription reading, "Rule is resonance." Unfortunately, the stone cracked during transport, and the fragment disappeared. Some say it was destroyed by skeptics, others by accident. Either way, the phrase endures, whispered in the corners of online forums and late-night documentaries. Rule is resonance. You can't help but smile. It sounds like something a sleep-deprived DJ might say at 3 a.m., but it also feels right. Thanks for watching. You sit on the palace steps for a while, imagining what it must have been like to live under such rulers. Perhaps they weren't gods or tyrants, but conductors keeping chaos in tune. The people brought problems, and the rulers adjusted frequencies, social or literal, until harmony returned. It's poetic, maybe delusional, but comforting in its way. Mainstream historians, of course, have a simpler take. The rulers were just monarchs, their palaces built by slave labor, their wealth hoarded through conquest and trade. That's history's baseline: power earned, power abused, power lost. But myths serve another purpose. They turn the cold machinery of empire into something warm, luminous, and strangely humane. The courtyard birds begin to stir, darting between pillars that cast long, perfect shadows. Somewhere deep in the palace, a faint hum starts again, just the wind moving through vents, but you let yourself believe it's something more. Maybe the empire isn't entirely gone. Maybe it's just humming at a frequency modern ears can't quite hear anymore. Before you leave, you glance back at the throne, half expecting someone to be sitting there now, some ancient ruler made of light and patience, nodding as if to say, "Keep walking." You're not ready for the whole story yet. You rise, stretch, and take one last look at the horizon beyond the palace walls. The world feels wider, emptier, and yet buzzing with quiet intent. You start walking again, your footsteps blending with that ghostly hum until they sound like part of the same song. By the time you leave the Palace of Echoes behind, the morning mist has turned gold. You follow a winding road paved in something that feels too precise to be ancient. Each slab identical, every joint aligned as though a giant hand pressed the earth into order. The path leads toward a distant plateau where shapes shimmer through the haze spires, domes, and what looks suspiciously like antennae, though you tell yourself that's impossible. The locals call this place the skybridge citadel. It's said that here, the rulers of Tartaria communed with forces beyond the horizon, celestial, magnetic, maybe even cosmic. You're not sure which version you prefer, astronomers with telescopes the size of towers, or monks holding crystal rods that hum when lightning strikes. Both sound equally mad and equally marvelous. As you climb, the wind grows sharper, cutting through your sleeves like chilled silk. Around you, rusted metal frames jut from the rock. Some look like remnants of scaffolding, others like something far more deliberate, thin rods embedded at geometric intervals. It's the first mainstream historical fact of this section. Several real-world archaeological sites across Central Asia and Siberia contain unexplained metallic structures, often dismissed as lightning rods or early telegraph prototypes. They're dated vaguely to the 18th or 19th centuries, too late for myth, too early for modern engineering. The fringe interpretation? These were sky conduits, antennae used by the Tartarian elite to harness atmospheric electricity. The theory borrows heavily from the legend of the ether towers, supposedly part of a global wireless energy network long before Tesla was born. You grin at the audacity of it. The idea that forgotten monarchs once juiced the atmosphere for power sounds like the perfect bedtime sci-fi tale. You stop beside one of the rods, half buried in the ground. It's made of a dull silver metal, strangely uncorroded. You brush away dirt and it gleams faintly blue. Static crackles against your fingertips. Maybe that's imagination. Or maybe the mountain is still charged from last night's storm. You let your hand hover there, savoring the tickle of invisible energy. A scholarly debate flickers in your mind. Could pre-industrial civilizations have experimented with electrostatic technology? Some evidence from Baghdad batteries, Leyden jars, and natural voltaic systems says well. Electricity was known, but barely. Harnessing it at scale would require a conceptual leap centuries ahead of its time. Still, a few researchers insist that scattered relics hint at a broader understanding lost to colonial reinterpretation. And maybe that's what happened here. Maybe the Tartarian towers weren't mystical at all, just early attempts at telegraphy, repurposed in legend as monuments of power. After all, once a technology is forgotten, it starts looking like magic. You wander farther uphill, the plateau widening into an open field of stone platforms. Each is circular, etched with spiraling grooves. They look eerily like turntables or ancient launch pads. Your rational mind mutters, observatories. Your half-dreaming mind whispers landing pads. Either way, you're standing on something designed for communication, whether with the heavens or with each other. A light joke surfaces. Imagine being the Tartarian intern assigned to dust these antennas. Careful, kid. One wrong polish and you'll short out the moon. You chuckle softly. There's an odd tranquility here. The air hums faintly, a tone too low for machines but too steady for mere wind. You sit for a while, watching clouds slide past. Each gust seems to shift the frequency of that hum, as though the landscape itself were tuning to atmospheric mood. A quirky tidbit from an obscure travelogue pops into your memory. In 1824, a Prussian explorer claimed he visited a city where the towers sang to the weather. He described spires made of metal alloys that vibrated audibly during storms. Locals supposedly used these vibrations to predict rainfall. Mainstream historians dismissed the story as exaggeration, yet metallurgists later proved that some alloys can indeed resonate with changing barometric pressure. So maybe singing towers weren't entirely poetic, they just had excellent acoustics. The scholar in you knows that's explanation enough. The dreamer in you insists there's more. What if the vibrations weren't just forecasts but messages? Communication through resonance, Tartaria sending songs to the clouds. You climb the tallest platform. At its center stands a circular pedestal about waist high. Its surface bears shallow grooves that spiral inward, forming something that looks suspiciously like a record. You half expect to find a label. Greatest Hits of the Empire, Volume I. But there's only dust and the faint smell of ozone. You reach out, trace one groove with a fingertip, and your skin tingles. It's just texture. But your mind fills in the sound deep, throbbing bass from centuries ago, an entire civilization humming through stone. Maybe that's what power felt like here, not control, but connectivity. The leaders of Tartaria, standing on these platforms, not commanding the sky but listening to it. The mainstream account gives a humbler version. Observatories, magnetic survey stations, or defensive watchtowers. Some Russian records even mention etheric devices, though the term likely meant barometers or static testers. Still, even scientists debate the accuracy of those descriptions. The line between barometer and mystic receiver depends mostly on how romantic your translator is. As the afternoon light warms the stone, you notice faint lines etched beyond the circles connecting each platform to the next, forming an enormous geometric grid visible only from above. You pull back and squint. It looks familiar, the same geometry you saw carved in the palace courtyard earlier. Could the palaces and sky citadels have been part of one network, a continent-wide design invisible until you step far enough away to see it? It's a thought that would drive most archaeologists to distraction or delight. depending on how much coffee they've had. You sit cross-legged, eyes closed, and try to imagine the place in its prime. Towers shimmering with copper coils, electric halos sparking gently at dusk, the air vibrating like the plucked string of a colossal instrument, messengers sending signals not with smoke or drum beats, but with modulated resonance carried by air itself. The wind picks up again. The hum deepens. For a moment, you think you hear voices distant, overlapping, layered in tone. They might be memory, or maybe the wind moving through the rods. Either way, the effect is hauntingly beautiful. When you open your eyes, lightning flickers on the horizon, brief but silent. You can almost believe the towers are calling it in, inviting the storm closer. There's one final historical fact worth mentioning. Atmospheric electricity was first documented in earnest during the mid-1700s. Benjamin Franklin flew his kite. European savants built Leyden jars. And all across the world, people experimented with static. The idea that energy could fall from the sky was intoxicating and terrifying. If Tartaria's builders lived through similar discoveries, their sky citadels might simply be echoes of that global fascination. Not supernatural, just human curiosity sparking early. But the myth endures because it sounds better this way. A civilization that talked to storms. You stand, stretch, and begin your descent. The sun is setting now, drenching everything in molten orange. The rods gleam like tuning forks catching their last note. As you look back, you swear you see faint arcs of light dancing between them, tiny, harmless flashes, like static on an ancient radio. Maybe the Empire's song never really stopped. Maybe you just tuned into it for a moment. You take one last breath of that charged air and smile to yourself. If they really were harnessing the sky, you murmur, I hope they left good instructions. The wind answers with a low, playful hum. You breathe in the scent of stone dust and ozone as you step through the veiled corridors of history, where echoes of collapsing empires drift like dry leaves. The Tartarian collapse, ah yes. The great unraveling of a civilization that supposedly spanned continents and epochs is both a riddle and a mirror. Tonight, you follow the tremors backward, tracing the many theories of its fall. No one agrees, of course. That's the first clue that something deliciously mysterious happened here. You picture yourself wandering a long-forgotten boulevard, the sky bruised with the color of dying embers. Was it war that toppled Tartaria, or something quieter like deliberate forgetting? The mainstream historians, bless their sleep-deprived hearts, usually opt for something sensible. Internal conflict, resource exhaustion, climate shifts. The usual dinner menu of empire-ending woes. Yet, the alternative theorists raise an eyebrow and whisper of erasure, not just by nature, but by design. You hear it in their tone. They didn't fall, they were deleted. And you pause, mid-step, picturing some ancient bureaucrat leaning over a parchment map, his hand trembling as he draws a thick, final line through a continent. A civilization redacted. The mainstream version has structure at least. Archaeologists point to layers of mud flood debris across Eurasia, claiming natural disaster, tectonic shifts, or glacial melt patterns. Climate scientists find pollen records suggesting abrupt cooling, possibly the Little Ice Age turning crueler than anticipated. Whole harvests might have failed. Cities starved, migrations followed. Logical, tidy. You could almost nod off to it. But the fringe version, that's where the pulse quickens. They say Tartaria didn't merely fade. It was overthrown, systematically dismantled. The architectural symmetry you saw in earlier sections, the spires, the impossible domes, the electric patterns in their city plans was too advanced, too coordinated. Someone decided that level of cohesion was dangerous. And so, the story goes, the empire was fractured intentionally, its symbols buried, its machines dismantled, its name scrubbed clean from record. Imagine walking through St. Petersburg, or Samarkand, or Ulan-Ude, and wondering what if this was all once the same civilization, now cut into geopolitical jigsaw pieces. What if the collapse was more of a cover story for an intentional reset? You pause before a cracked marble archway, fingertips brushing the cold stone. Historians will tell you that architecture simply evolves. Gothic gives way to Baroque, which bows to neoclassical, but Tartaria's remains seem to skip steps, too modern in some places, too ancient in others, as if someone had fast-forwarded and rewound civilization on the same reel. Theories multiply like ivy. One insists the collapse followed a great electrical war, where Tartarian dynamos, those mysterious towers and magneto devices, were turned against each other, sending arcs of lightning across cities. Another claims a celestial event, a comet or solar pulse, fried the power network, leaving the populace bewildered in a suddenly dark world. The academic world, predictably, waves these away as pseudoscience. But even within respectable halls, the collapse remains awkwardly incomplete. Excavations reveal abrupt abandonment layers, buildings vacated, tools mid-use, food carbonized but uneaten, not a slow fade, but a sharp line, as if the world had paused between breaths. Picture it, a busy Tartarian marketplace, humming with traders and tinkers, when suddenly nothing. The sound of carts stops, the air thickens, time itself hesitates. You imagine a potter looking up at a flash in the sky. Then, darkness. Of course, skepticism demands you ask, how can a civilization so vast simply vanish without trace? The obvious answer is, it didn't. Its bones became the foundations of the next empire, its technologies absorbed and rebranded. The Roman Empire fell, but its laws live on in modern codes. The Byzantine Empire collapsed, but its rituals echo in every Orthodox church. Perhaps Tartaria simply shape-shifted into something we still walk through, unknowingly. A faint hum reaches your ears, the imagined vibration of lost machines beneath your feet. You smirk. Perhaps it's only the subway. Or maybe not. There's also the scholarly debate that never dies. Were the supposed Tartarian cities products of a single state, or just a stylistic coincidence spread by trade and empire? Some linguists propose that Tartaria was a European label, a convenient box for the unknown beyond the Urals. Others argue it was self-identified, a unified name erased when history's pen changed hands. You turn a mental corner and arrive at the idea of propaganda. History, after all, is written by the survivors and edited by the victors. If Tartaria had technologies or philosophies inconvenient to later powers, erasing them might have been less costly than absorbing them. Think of it as a soft cultural deletion, one generation forgetting the passwords to the previous one's archives. Even the maps play tricks on you. 17th century atlases boldly labelled Tartaria across northern Asia. By the 19th, it's gone. Not conquered, not renamed, just gone. As if cartographers collectively agreed to unsee it. Try explaining that over coffee to a historian and watch their eyebrows attempt escape velocity. And then there's the mud. Always the mud. Entire buildings partially buried, windows at street level turned into basements. The mud flood theory insists that a cataclysmic slurry covered cities overnight. Mainstream geology says erosion and centuries of urban layering can do that naturally. Fringe minds counter. But why the uniformity? The strange precision of the buried floors across continents. You crouch, brushing dust off your knees, caught between tectonic logic and whispered sabotage. A historian in St. Petersburg once joked, if Tartaria existed, it must have died of paperwork, bureaucratic collapse, the invisible kind. But maybe the joke hides something sharper, that civilizations don't need war or asteroids to vanish. Sometimes they're erased by changing definitions, by who gets to call something real. And isn't that what keeps the story alive? The tension between proof and possibility, between stratified ruins and the dream that beneath them lies a deeper, hidden order. You walk through it like through mist, never sure where the ground solidifies. As the night deepens, you imagine standing on the last night of Tartaria itself. The air tastes metallic, thunder growling in the distance. Lanterns flicker. A scholar clutches a scroll, perhaps a record of everything that must not be forgotten. Then, a tremor. A wave of silence. Maybe it's a literal flood. Maybe it's a bureaucratic decree. Maybe it's both. And when the sun rises, there's no empire. Only a patchwork of successor states staring at ornate ruins, each claiming they built them first. So you walk, tracing the outlines of absence, listening to what history refuses to say. Somewhere, beneath the academic dust, Tartaria still hums half fact, half fever dream. The collapse, you realize, might not be the end of the story at all. It's the moment it became myth. You linger amid the ruins a little longer, your breath fogging in the cool air as dawn seeps between the broken arches. If the fall of Tartaria left behind echoes, those echoes are carved not just in stone, but in symbols. Everywhere you turn, on lintels, spires, crumbling fountains, you see them, spirals that fold into themselves, twin-headed eagles, a recurring motif of a radiant sun behind a domed structure. You squint and wonder, are these letters, numbers, or simply the artistic habits of long-dead stonemasons? You crouch close, running your fingertips along the cold engraving. The groove feels deliberate, purposeful. The debate, linguistic versus decorative, is as old as the mystery itself. Scholars with tweed jackets and magnifying glasses insist it's all ornamental, flourishes borrowed from Byzantine or Persian styles. Fringe researchers, those who live-stream from dimly lit basements with way too much enthusiasm, claim these are fragments of an unknown Tartarian script, pre-Cyrillic, pre-Latin, pre-anything, they whisper. And there you are, somewhere between the two camps, tracing the symbol as though it might speak if only you listened long enough. Every empire has a language, and every language hides a worldview. If Tartaria truly existed as a unified civilization, then its writing, or lack thereof, is a gaping hole. Historians point out, no verified Tartarian manuscripts, no bilingual inscriptions, no grammar tables, but others argue that absence itself is suspicious. Erasure, they mutter again, the same word that's followed you through these shadowed corridors since Section 8. You remember that dusty library rumor, the locked archives of Kazan or Omsk, said to contain fragments of metal plates etched with strange ideograms. Officially, those plates are lost or misidentified. Convenient. But in the dim circles of online Tartaria forums, people circulate grainy photos of curving symbols that look like a cross between Sanskrit and circuitry. There's something hypnotic about that. Ancient language meets electrical diagram. A mainstream historical fact helps tether you for a moment. In Central Asia, real Turkic scripts like Old Uyghur, Orkhon, and Khitan were carved into stone centuries before modern alphabets. Those are tangible, datable, catalogued. But the symbols you see in alleged Tartarian ruins don't quite match anything known. Too geometric, too repetitive. You tilt your head, why carve pure geometry unless it meant something? A breeze rattles through the ruins, carrying dust and the faint tang of ozone. You half expect the symbols to glow. Some believe these carvings were part of an energy system, a code not for speech, but for frequency. Architectural resonance, they call it. The idea that Tartarian builders inscribed patterns to harmonize with vibration, to make structures hum with specific tones. To the skeptical mind, it's nonsense. To your drowsy, curious one, it's oddly poetic. You lean back, imagining the buildings alive with soft sound, cathedrals literally singing, a civilization that didn't just speak language but lived in it, as vibration and light. You smirk at your own romanticism. Then again, every archaeologist begins as a dreamer. The scholarly debate, predictably, rages on. Linguists argue there's no evidence of a lost alphabet, pointing to how universal decorative motifs spread through trade and conquest. Art historians note that spirals, suns, and wings appear in countless cultures, from Egypt to Mongolia. To call them Tartarian is like calling the letter A proprietary, but then you glance at one peculiar detail. The consistent placement. These symbols often cluster near power centers, government halls, observatories, towers with suspicious copper domes. Coincidence, perhaps, or a subtle signature. It reminds you of how medieval stonemasons left hidden marks on cathedrals, personal signatures etched in corners. But those were small, almost secret. The Tartarian marks, by contrast, dominate facades as if shouting, "Remember us." You imagine a Tartarian scribe, call him Anar Bek or something suitably poetic, etching a symbol onto a freshly poured arch. He hums softly as he works. Maybe it's a sun sigil, maybe an instruction manual. The empire around him hums too, towers glowing, aqueducts whispering. He finishes the mark, steps back, and watches the afternoon light catch in the groove. Centuries later, you arrive, trying to read it. You tilt your head again, this time noting a pattern you missed. Many of the sunburst motifs have 12 rays. 12 like the months, the zodiac, the voltages on an old generator dial. Coincidence or code? The more you look, the more the line blurs. Every historian knows the human brain is wired for pattern recognition. It's a survival trick, not always a reliable one. You see meaning where there may be none, and none where meaning hides. Perhaps that's why the Tartarian script debate feels endless. It's less about the symbols and more about us, the interpreters. A joke floats into your mind, half remembered from a weary archaeologist in Tashkent. The Tartarians didn't vanish. They just ran out of punctuation. You chuckle under your breath, the sound oddly comforting in the empty square. And then you remember a quirkier rumor, those metallic Tartarian plates again. Some say they weren't written artifacts at all, but sound recording mediums. Early phonograph equivalents, etched with vibrations rather than letters. Allegedly, when modern scientists tried to scan them, machines malfunctioned. Radiation spikes, battery drain, mysterious shutdowns. Of course, none of this is peer-reviewed, it's fringe at its finest, but in the soft light of speculation, it feels deliciously eerie. You stand in front of one of those engraved doors, tracing patterns like a puzzle. The symbols seem to loop into infinity. No clear start or end. Maybe that's the point. A script meant to be read as rhythm, not logic, like a song you hum without knowing why. Scholars still gather annually in quiet conferences to debate these markings. Some bring 3D models, some bring high-resolution scans. The debate usually circles back to 3 possibilities. Language A. Written system lost to time, perhaps phonetic or logographic. Art merely decoration, an aesthetic unmoored from meaning. Hybrid code. A system bridging sound, math, and design, like musical notation made of stone. Each camp leaves frustrated, coffee cups empty, grant proposals unwritten. But you? You just stand there, listening. The sun climbs higher. The carvings catch light, casting strange shadows that shift as the day warms. For a moment, it feels like the symbols themselves are moving, like they respond to sunlight, aligning with some celestial rhythm. Maybe that's your imagination. Maybe that's exactly what the builders wanted, for their creations to feel alive. You think of modern graffiti artists, signing walls to claim presence. Maybe the Tartarian marks were no different human fingerprints across centuries, or maybe they were prayers, invocations of permanence against the inevitability of forgetting, and that, in the end, might be their truest function, a silent rebellion against oblivion. You smile faintly, brushing dust from your hands. The symbols have told you nothing concrete, no grammar, no meaning, yet somehow, they've said everything that matters. We were here. We built. We mattered. You take one last look before walking away. The carvings glowing gold in the morning light. Somewhere deep down, you hope that when your own world crumbles, some future wanderer will find your marks too and wonder what language you once spoke. Your journey takes you beyond the ruins now, where the wind carries fewer whispers and more written words. Not the elegant glyphs of lost Tartarian builders, but the shaky ink of foreign travelers, men with notebooks, quills, and a healthy sense of self-importance. These are the witnesses who may or may not have glimpsed Tartaria before the dust settled, and tonight you'll sift through their words like an archaeologist of imagination, trying to separate truth from travel brag. The first record you hold in your mind is by a Venetian merchant from the late 1500s. He wrote of a vast and ordered empire beyond Muscovy, ruled by lords whose towers scrape the sun. His sketch, preserved in a water-damaged journal, shows onion domes floating above geometric plazas. Mainstream historians shrug and say, he must have seen Central Asia through wine-tinted spectacles. Fringe thinkers, of course, beam with delight proof. They say that Tartaria was no myth but a place that smelled of cinnamon and brass. Then comes a Jesuit missionary, Father Alvar de Montoya, who wrote in 1623 that he'd reached the western gate of Tartaria, where he saw machines that pumped water without beasts, and lanterns that burned with no flame. You imagine him staring, robes flapping, trying to describe electrical lighting centuries before Edison's birth. Scholars wave the flag of skepticism, translation errors, exaggeration, misidentification of Chinese or Persian technology. Yet the phrase remains. Lanterns with no flame. You picture those lanterns glowing softly in the mist, their light reflected in pools of still water, their builders smiling quietly as foreigners fumbled for words. By the 18th century, explorers start contradicting one another. British officers sketch maps labeling Great Tartary but offer no coordinates. Russian cartographers fill in blank spaces with mountain doodles and tidy Cyrillic notes. Terra incognita. A few brave travelers, fur traders, botanists, diplomatic envoys venture east and return with strange consistency in their vagueness. Endless plains, they say, mysterious cities of white stone, people of noble bearing, suspicious of outsiders. You roll your eyes affectionately. In fairness, that could describe half of Eurasia, yet the pattern remains. Wherever these travelers wandered, something grand lingered just beyond their comprehension, like a mirage of order amid chaos. Here comes the mainstream historical fact for tonight. From the 16th to 19th centuries, Tartary was a blanket European term for the enormous, poorly mapped lands of Central and Northern Asia regions populated by diverse cultures, Turkic, Mongolic, Siberian, and beyond. Tartaria, in maps and letters, was less an empire and more a placeholder for the unknown. When scholars say it never existed as a unified state, they're technically right, but when conspiracy enthusiasts say the term hides something forgotten, they might be emotionally right. The truth, as usual, is somewhere awkwardly in the middle, standing at a bar, sipping tea, pretending not to pick sides. A quirky tidbit interrupts your reasoning. One traveller in 1712, an Austrian diplomat named Johannes Clemen, claimed he was given a coin bearing the sigil of Tartaria, a double-headed eagle surrounded by lightning bolts. No such coin has ever surfaced. Some enthusiasts suggest it was melted down by the Russians. Others say it was pocket change from a different empire entirely. Still, you find the image charming, an empire so advanced that its currency flashes with electricity. Then there's the legend of the Amber Pavilion, a mythical Tartarian palace described by multiple travelers in different centuries. One calls it a hall where the walls glow as if the sun were trapped within. Another insists it was melted during the Great Deluge. Archaeologists haven't found it, of course, but the persistent repetition of detail makes you wonder whether some luminous building, perhaps plated with mica or gold leaf, really stood somewhere in the steppes. You drift through these accounts like flipping through postcards from parallel worlds. Each writer confident, each map incomplete. The scholarly debate rears its elegant, tired head again. Were these travelers actually seeing fragments of multiple empires, the Golden Horde, the Timrid dynasty, Qing frontiers, and conflating them under one mysterious name? Probably, but probably is a dull word, and dull words rarely echo through centuries. You imagine a 17th century travel party trudging across snow, their boots crunching, their guide muttering in a language they don't understand. On the horizon, a structure rises. Metallic domes, staircases carved into white cliffs, towers bristling like tuning forks. They stare. Someone sketches. Someone else gets frostbite. The guide tells them they're looking at the western seat of the Sky Lords. Later, when warmth returns, the traveller writes, "I have glimpsed Tartaria." Maybe he didn't lie. Maybe he just didn't have the vocabulary. You grin at the thought. Even today, we name what we don't grasp. Dark matter, quantum foam, Tartaria, the comfort of labels for the unknowable. Some letters from the 18th century show something stranger. Bureaucratic censorship. A handful of explorers mention being told by officials not to record certain cities or structures. The Imperial Archives request omission. One Russian envoy wrote curtly in 1778, "Omission again." That familiar ghost. Mainstream history attributes that to political sensitivities or trade secrecy. But in the glow of midnight curiosity, you can't help but imagine something grander: maps deliberately redacted, reports sanitized, travelers silenced. You can almost hear the scratch of the censor's quill crossing out the word Tartaria. And yet, despite all that crossing out, the name survived. It slipped through ink and time, into whispered stories, and late-night YouTube binges. You pause to stretch, rolling your shoulders as if you've just trudged alongside those travelers yourself. Your shoes, imaginary though they are, feel dusty, a gentle joke to keep things light. You suspect half those explorers exaggerated just to impress their sponsors back home. "Dearest patron," they'd write, "I have discovered a land of self-lighting lamps and people who levitate politely at sunset." You can almost see the investors nodding, coins clinking, reality evaporating. Still, part of you admires the audacity. That's how myths are born, through a mix of curiosity, ego, and bad cartography. If you could speak to one of them now, maybe Father Montoya or Clement the coin collector, you'd ask, what did you really see? Not what you thought would sell, not what your empire wanted you to record. What did your eyes whisper to your heart when the horizon shimmered with something you couldn't name? Maybe he'd shrug, maybe he'd smile sadly, maybe he'd say, something vast, something older than us. The night hums around you as though agreeing. The travelers are long gone, their maps folded away, their bones dust beneath steps, but their words remain half accurate, half dream. You tuck them carefully into the growing puzzle of Tartaria, one shaky ink line at a time, and somewhere between those fading pages, the empire breathes again just for a heartbeat. You walk through a city that isn't supposed to belong to Tartaria anymore. The signs are in Russian, the flags bear eagles and stars, the streets hum with trams and cafe chatter. Yet, as you wander further in, you start noticing something unsettling. These buildings look older than their supposed construction dates. Too refined, too massive, too pre-modern. The thought tickles the back of your mind. Maybe this city wasn't built after Tartaria's fall. Maybe it was redecorated. You pause before a government building, its pillars soaring like petrified trees. A plaque says it was built in 1893, but the foundation stones look weathered, as if they've seen 1,000 winters more. The line between restoration and inheritance begins to blur, reparations of memory. You think how later empires took Tartaria's bones and dressed them in their own flags. Mainstream historians call it reuse, adaptive architecture, classical revival. Perfectly normal, they assure you. When an empire collapses, the next one builds right on top. It's a form of efficiency, a convenient recycling of triumph. But the deeper you look, the more deliberate it seems. Not just reuse rebranding. Tartarian domes become Imperial Russian domes. Tartarian towers become Victorian curiosities. The erasure continues, not by destruction this time, but by absorption. You imagine a city official in the 19th century, standing before a team of masons. These old spires. Keep them. Just scrape off the strange sun symbols and add some angels. And just like that, the past is refurbished, polished, and safely reclassified. You step into a museum, the kind with marble floors and a slightly judgmental silence. Glass cases display artifacts labeled with comforting certainty, Russian, Imperial, Mongol, Byzantine influence. Yet one gilded panel catches your attention. The script on it doesn't match anything you've seen before. Beneath it, a polite card reads, "Provenance unknown, possibly decorative." You almost laugh. Possibly decorative, the academic equivalent of a shrug. A fringe historian you once watched online. A wiry man with the energy of someone who consumes both espresso and forbidden PDFs, who once claimed that museums are memory laundering facilities. You don't buy all his theories, but you can't help thinking of that phrase now. It makes sense in a way. Empires don't just conquer land, they conquer narrative. They rename mountains, repaint flags, repurpose ruins. Tartaria might have died not by war, but by paperwork, again, architectural reclassification, cultural annexation. Outside, the city hums on. A tram squeals by, sparks raining from its wires. You notice, with mild amusement, that the electric poles align perfectly with the city's ancient avenues. Modern grids laid upon old arteries. Even technology follows old bones. You recall a verified historical fact. When St. Petersburg was constructed in the early 18th century, much of its material, its bricks, its marble was taken from older, abandoned settlements across the steppes. Peter the Great wanted a modern capital, but he built it from ancient stone. Some buildings, historians now admit, predate their official blueprints. A few even show signs of flood sediment higher than the supposed foundation year. Coincidence, perhaps, or inheritance? You wander toward the river, watching reflections of neon lights dance against carved embankments. You imagine those same embankments centuries ago, not glowing with electricity, but with lamplight and whispered prayers to forgotten emperors. The quirky rumor tonight that the Winter Palace itself sits atop Tartarian catacombs, vaulted chambers sealed after a mud event. Some explorers have tried to find entrances, only to be stopped by polite but firm museum staff. The story goes that the lower floors, now basement storage, were once street level. Every generation, it seems, builds a little higher on the bones of the one before. You run your hand along a bridge railing, smooth and cold as logic. The scholarly debate here is less about existence and more about attribution. Are we simply misreading the evolution of architecture, or did something truly get overwritten? Mainstream scholars say it's natural progression. Fringe researchers say the pattern of identical facades across continents, same arches in Paris, Delhi, Street, Petersburg, Buenos Aires, points to a single template civilization. Tartarian universal architecture, they call it. The mainstream counterargument is tidy. Neoclassical aesthetics spread globally through colonization, trade, and the shared prestige of symmetry. Yet when you see the same identical world fairs constructed in cities thousands of miles apart, all said to have been built and demolished within months, it makes you pause. The speed, the uniformity, the convenient transience, it all smells faintly of narrative glue holding something bigger together. You wander through one of those fairgrounds. Well, what remains of it? A rusted gate, a broken fountain, grass reclaiming marble walkways. The sign says built in 1900, but the erosion feels older, like it's been dreaming longer than that. The notion creeps in that maybe these world expositions weren't showcases of progress, but cover stories for rediscovered Tartarian architecture structures, unearthed, exhibited, then demolished, before questions could multiply. You grin at yourself. It's a wild thought. But then again, history's stranger than fiction. At least fiction needs foreshadowing. In a nearby square, you watch tourists take selfies beside a monumental statue. They don't notice the faint, half-erased inscriptions beneath its plinth letters that don't match any known alphabet. The guidebook doesn't mention them. The audio tour skips that detail. And so they remain, quiet survivors of a time when even words were carved differently. You tilt your head and think of the term palimpsest, a manuscript scraped clean and rewritten, yet still bearing the ghost of the original text underneath. That's what this world feels like now. One vast palimpsest. Tartaria's story isn't gone. It's simply overwritten, its letters bleeding faintly through modern ink. And maybe that's why these cities feel haunted not by ghosts, but by memories of what they used to be. As twilight deepens, you picture a secret meeting in the 1800s, engineers and bureaucrats debating how to handle legacy structures from a previous age. Rebrand them, someone says. Call them neoclassical. Another nods. File the rest under ruins. Pens scratch. Decisions harden. And an entire empire becomes footnote material. You sigh. It's both tragic and deeply human. We've always preferred tidy stories over complicated truths, but maybe, just maybe, the reclamation is happening in reverse now. You, and others like you, wandering through old courtyards with curious eyes, are restoring what was erased. Not physically, perhaps, but imaginatively. And imagination, after all, is the first step toward resurrection. As the lamps flicker on above you, their golden light spills across the facades of repurposed Tartarian bones. You whisper quietly to the stones, just in case they're still listening. I see you. The air seems to warm slightly. Or maybe that's just the night sighing in relief. Morning comes not like a sunrise, but like a revelation. You wake to the sound of church bells echoing over rooftops that look suspiciously ancient for their modern design dates. The city's mist curls through the streets, soft and heavy, as if reluctant to reveal what lies beneath. You sip your coffee by the window, eyes tracing the skyline spires, domes, towers, all belonging to different eras, yet strangely harmonious, like they were designed by the same invisible architect. You grab your notebook. Today's mission: the archives. It's funny how archives sound so official, so authoritative, yet half their power lies in omission. You walk through a grand hall of marble pillars, where clerks move with the seriousness of priests. The air smells like old paper and bureaucracy, a scent you've come to associate with selective memory. You request access to 18th, 19th century construction records. The librarian raises an eyebrow. For which city? She asks. All of them, you want to say. Instead, you smile politely. Street Petersburg will do. She disappears. And you wait. Time stretches. A clock ticks, a patient reminder that history takes its time to misfile itself. Finally, she returns with a cart stacked high with brittle leather-bound ledgers. You sit at a long oak table and begin flipping through the pages. At first, it's just what you'd expect. Lists of materials, names of architects, budget notations in ornate handwriting. Then something off, a column marked, Recovered Materials pre-1700. Another labelled, Local Adjustments to Ancient Foundation. The phrasing is careful, vague, but the implication is there. These cities weren't built from scratch, they were adapted. One note catches your eye. Original substructure remarkably intact. Proceed with facade overlay to conform with imperial aesthetic. Overlay. The word hums like electricity. You jot it down. It feels like finding a missing bone in a skeleton everyone insisted was whole. Your eyes drift to the margins of the page. Scribbles, maybe, from a distracted clerk show measurements. Sketches. Even a doodle of what looks like a sunburst emblem. You've seen that motif before on gate keystones, on bridges, and sometimes hidden in mosaics behind modern plaster. The librarian passes again, her eyes flicking toward your table. There's a polite tension in her smile, the kind reserved for visitors who dig too deep. You close the book, equally polite, just studying early masonry terminology. You say. She nods, but her gaze lingers a little too long. You decide to leave before curiosity becomes suspicious. Outside, the street feels lighter, freer. You clutch your notes, like relics. You take a tram to an older part of the city where maps fade and tour guides get vague. The road narrows, the cobblestones become uneven, and the air thickens with the scent of damp stone and time. A wrought iron gate leads you to a courtyard half buried in ivy. In its center stands an old fountain, dry now, its basin cracked. Around its rim, the same sunburst pattern repeats, half erased by centuries, but unmistakable. You crouch, tracing one with your fingertip. Beneath the moss, the carving feels deep, too deep for something meant to be decorative. You whisper the word again. Overlay. What if Tartaria's ruins weren't destroyed, but incorporated, layered into new cities like hidden code in software? You pull out your phone and check satellite images, an obsession of yours lately. The geometry is uncanny. Perfect radial layouts, concentric fortresses, city centers arranged with astronomical precision. Academics call it coincidence or urban planning aesthetics. But when identical patterns appear across continents from Russia to India to the American Midwest, coincidence starts to feel like laziness. You compare them side by side. The same 8-point star in different guises. A citadel here, a fortress there, a garden complex somewhere else, but all identical. Some researchers, the daring kind who publish on obscure websites before mysteriously disappearing from conferences, call these the star forts of Tartaria. Mainstream historians, of course, object. Star forts, they insist, were Renaissance-era designs spread by European engineers. But then, how to explain the examples buried beneath layers of supposed pre-colonial soil? How to explain identical fortresses that predate the civilizations credited with building them? The debate becomes almost philosophical. Are we seeing ancient unity or modern projection? A forgotten civilization, or our own longing for one? A sudden gust of wind scatters your notes across the courtyard. You scramble to gather them, laughing under your breath until you see that one page has landed against the fountain's base. Wedged between two stones, you pull it free and notice something odd. A faint glow where the paper touched the carved symbol. Just a trick of sunlight, perhaps, but it leaves you strangely unsettled. You pocket the paper and wander toward the river. The sun dips lower, painting everything gold. Boats drift lazily by, their ripples distorting reflections of the old facades. You lean on the railing and imagine the river centuries ago before industrial bridges and tram wires lined with Tartarian barges carrying crystal, gold, and marble. Some say the rivers were once energy conduits, part of a vast electromagnetic grid that powered the empire. Sounds absurd. And yet, you remember Nikola Tesla's notes about wireless energy transmission, his obsession with atmospheric currents, energy everywhere, for everyone. The words echo eerily close to the myths of Tartarian free power, the domed buildings and antennae-like spires said to harness atmospheric electricity. You glance at the nearest church dome, gilded and glinting in the light. What if those spires weren't just decorative? What if faith was only the later excuse for function? A professor once joked that every generation thinks it's the first to discover lost knowledge. But maybe we're the first generation to realize how much was intentionally buried. Your phone buzzes a message from a historian friend who humors your late-night theories. It's just one line. Check the map coordinates I sent. Star pattern visible beneath modern grid. You zoom in. The satellite overlay reveals it clearly. 5 circular plazas linked by avenues, forming a perfect pentagram, hidden in plain sight, beneath downtown traffic. You sit there for a long time, watching the golden sky fade to violet. The city lights flicker on, each one like a neuron awakening. You imagine the entire urban network lighting up again, Tartaria's dormant circuits humming beneath asphalt and concrete, waiting for someone to remember the original design. The thought thrills you and terrifies you, because if Tartaria wasn't a myth, if it really existed, if its technologies and cities were merely disguised, then the world's entire narrative scaffolding would wobble. Every empire that followed would be revealed as not a builder, but a borrower. And humanity, you realize, has always feared one thing above all: discovering that we're living inside someone else's ruins. A church bell tolls. The echo rolls through the air like an ancient memory resurfacing. You whisper to yourself, half amused, half awed, maybe Tartaria never vanished. Maybe we just stopped recognizing it. You take one last look at the city, its domes, its spires, its ghost geometry, and slip quietly into the twilight. Notebook in hand, the past whispering softly beneath your feet. You wake to the sound of distant drums, or maybe it's construction. Hard to tell these days when a jackhammer and a war drum share the same rhythm. Still, it feels appropriate. Today, you're thinking about Tartaria's military shadow, that hazy outline of power and protection that always seems to hang behind great civilizations. The first step is to admit you know almost nothing. Historians, after all, have plenty to say about Rome's legions, Persia's cavalry, or Britain's navy, but Tartaria. Nothing neat, nothing textbook ready, only scraps, murals, weapon fragments, and those unnervingly symmetrical fortress ruins. You stretch, pour yourself a cup of tea that tastes faintly of dust and déjà vu, and begin your mental march through history. If the Tartarians had an army, and most civilizations that build things do, it would have been unlike the rigid formations of Europe or the nomadic raids of the steppe. The empire's reach, according to believers, spanned continents, connected by strange etheric communication and impossible speed. That alone raises questions. How does a pre-industrial empire maintain cohesion across thousands of miles without telegraphs, trains, or bureaucracy? Some say they didn't need to. One fringe theory suggests Tartarian troops were resonant units, teams trained to move, fight, and even think in synchronized frequency. It sounds absurd until you remember that even modern militaries drill cadence to create unity, that ancient armies march to flutes and drums to align breath and heartbeat. Now imagine that principle amplified. Imagine soldiers moving like extensions of one organism, guided not by shouts or banners, but by energy harmonics emitted from domed signal towers. You smile at the thought. It's ridiculous, but wonderfully cinematic. Mainstream historians, naturally, prefer more tangible explanations. They point to evidence of complex fortifications, overlapping artillery platforms, and logistics systems that hint at remarkable organization. They note how Tartarian star forts, with their angular bastions and layered defenses, appear centuries ahead of what conventional military evolution would suggest. The scholarly debate always circles the same question. Did Tartaria develop such sophistication independently, or did later empires simply copy a lost global blueprint? You imagine a dusty conference hall, somewhere in Europe, academics arguing under fluorescent lights. One waves a laser pointer at a satellite image of a fortress in Siberia. Another insists it's just a later Russian bastion. But deep down, both know that no one builds something that's symmetrical by accident. You close your eyes and drift back into the field, a mental simulation of how it might have been. A cold wind sweeps over a plateau. The ground trembles slightly as massive iron chariots, yes, maybe even early tanks, rumble through the fog. They're not fueled by oil, but by steam and magnetism, drawing energy from some humming core deep beneath their hulls. Engineers in leather aprons adjust copper valves while soldiers in bronze-trimmed uniforms march beside them. The sound is low, resonant, almost melodic. A flagship rises in the distance, a colossal airship tethered to the ground by glowing cables. It's the stuff of legend, a flying fortress said to carry both troops and lightning weaponry. You've seen etchings that might depict such things, though skeptics claim they're just artistic exaggerations of hot air balloons. Still, the image lingers. One historical fact anchors the fantasy. In the 19th century, engineers across Eurasia documented inexplicable ruins that looked like airship docks, massive arches of stone and iron with no apparent civilian purpose. Some even appeared scorched, as though struck by energy discharges. Scholars chalk them up to industrial furnaces. Others whisper, Tartarian hangars. And then there are the weapons. Old chronicles speak of thunder cannons that could level walls without fire, of sonic trumpets that caused enemies to faint or flee. At first glance, it sounds mythological, until you realize how many cultures record similar devices. Jericho's trumpets, India's celestial weapons, even medieval legends of sound-based defense. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe sound like architecture. Like power has frequencies we've forgotten how to wield. You picture Tartarian engineers not as magicians, but as scientists so attuned to natural forces that their work looked like sorcery. To them, resonance wasn't mystical, it was military, a means of control, protection, maybe even deterrence. The scholarly debate over Tartaria's fall often touches this point. What happens when a civilization that commands nature itself loses balance? Some suggest a weapon backfired, a catastrophe of resonance, perhaps a global earthquake, perhaps an atmospheric discharge. The mud flood theories, those apocalyptic stories of entire cities half buried overnight, might stem from that technological collapse. The historian in you wants to roll your eyes. The dreamer leans forward. You stroll through a modern museum, white walls, soft lights, and glass cases filled with artifacts stripped of their mystery. You stop before a set of intricate brass components labeled simply hydraulic pressure regulator, 19th century. But the design is unlike any industrial machinery you've seen. Concentric rings, engravings in geometric script. You ask the curator where it was found. Oh, somewhere in Central Asia, she says, half shrugging. The exact site's uncertain. Probably a piece of local engineering. You nod politely, but inside, the gears are already spinning. That night, you cross-reference the pattern on the brass, with Tartarian symbols, those starbursts and spirals. They match almost perfectly. Could this pressure regulator have been a component of a weapon system? Or a power amplifier? Or, as one online theory dares suggest, a resonance harmonizer, a device meant to stabilize atmospheric energy grids? You sigh. You've read too many midnight forums. But still, it's strange, isn't it? How official museums rarely display artifacts that don't fit neatly into a timeline. Items misclassified, under research, or quietly stored in basements. One quirky tidbit you remember. In 1908, after the Tunguska explosion, local witnesses described not fire, but a great humming in the sky. That word humming sticks with you. A resonance event, perhaps? A relic of lost technology shaking itself awake? You turn the thought over like a coin. On one side, rational skepticism. On the other, the glint of wonder. A modern general once said, "Every weapon eventually outlives its purpose." Maybe Tartaria's downfall wasn't conquest, but consequence, its own brilliance devouring itself. You imagine the moment. A city glowing with energy, towers humming, domes vibrating like tuning forks. Then, Suddenly silence, a misalignment, a surge. The sky itself flickers. Then comes the flood, the dust, the long forgetting. By morning, all that remains are ruins and stories. You stare out your window again. The modern skyline feels almost mocking skyscrapers trying to imitate grandeur, antennas reaching where spires once touched the heavens. You wonder if we're repeating the cycle building towers without understanding the forces that toppled the last. Maybe the real military shadow of Tartaria isn't an army, but a warning that power, once harnessed, is never truly lost. It just waits. A low thunder rolls in the distance. You glance up, half expecting to see a floating fortress emerging from the clouds. But it's only a storm, or so you tell yourself. The storm that rolled in last night hasn't really left. By morning, the sky is still bruised and heavy. The streets slick with that kind of reflective rain that turns cities into mirrors. You walk through puddles, tracing the same old routes, but seeing everything twice the real and the reflected. It feels appropriate somehow for what you're exploring today. Tartaria's trade routes and lost commodities. A world where even commerce seemed to shimmer between reality and legend. You duck into a cafe for warmth. The barista greets you with a smile that feels too modern for the ancient mysteries rattling in your head. You order something strong and sit by the window, notebook open, pen ready. You're about to chase ghosts of gold, silk, mercury, and myth. Most historians agree that trade defines civilization. Where goods move, so do ideas, art, and empire. The Tartarian Empire, if it existed as vast as people whisper, would have pulsed with arteries of exchange spanning continents. But here's the puzzle. Where are the records? Mainstream scholars say the lack of trade documents proves Tartaria never existed. Fringe theorists say the same lack proves it did and was systematically erased. You sip your coffee and smile. In this field, absence itself becomes evidence. You flip through an old atlas, you brought a facsimile of a 17th century map. The Great Silk Road cuts across Eurasia like a scar, but along its northern flank runs a lesser-known path. Labelled simply Tartary, the line snakes through deserts, across steppes, over mountains into places no modern highway dares to follow. You trace it with your finger and imagine caravans shimmering under moonlight, their wheels creaking, bells jingling softly through the cold air. The merchants carry more than goods. They carry stories, rumors of machines that never rust, fabrics that glow in darkness, metals that hum faintly when struck. One mainstream historical fact keeps cropping up in your research. In the 18th century, European traders frequently described mysterious alloys and fine conductive metals entering global markets. From the north, origin uncertain. They called them sky steel, white iron, even auric copper. Modern metallurgists now think these were early experiments in high zinc, brass, or meteorite iron, but in the Tartarian narrative, they were remnants of a technology that blended metallurgy and magnetism. You picture it markets where merchants sell shimmering discs said to capture lightning, liquid glass that holds light for hours, powdered quartz used to heal metals. It sounds fantastical, yet every empire has had its strange trades. Damascus steel, Roman concrete, Chinese porcelain. Perhaps Tartaria's exports were simply their lost equivalents. Too advanced or too misunderstood to survive translation. There's a fringe tidbit you can't shake. Somewhere deep in Siberia, explorers once found vast underground vaults, lined with mirror-polished stone and filled with what looked like mechanical fragments, copper tubing, stone gears, even petrified wires. The discovery vanished from official reports after one season. The surviving photos, grainy and ambiguous, fueled decades of online debates. Some said it was an abandoned Soviet experiment. Others, an ancient Tartarian depot. As always, the truth probably lies somewhere inconveniently in between. You lean back and watch the rain streak down the window. In the reflection, your face hovers above the map like a ghost navigator. You wonder what kind of economy could sustain a civilization so grand yet so invisible in written record. Maybe their trade wasn't only material. The scholars call this symbolic economy, where exchange happens through ritual, architecture, even frequency. Imagine trade routes, not of silk or spice, but of knowledge. Cities built at energy nodes sharing not goods but harmonics. To some, it's pseudoscience. To others, It's the missing explanation for the geometric precision of Tartarian cities. You remember the grid lines you studied earlier? How those star-fort layouts often correspond with ancient ley lines. Coincidence? Or infrastructure? Maybe both. Maybe Tartaria's greatest trade wasn't what they shipped, but what they transmitted. Still, every empire leaves debris. Coins, tools, pottery shards. So where's Tartaria's debris? You once read about a cache of ornate coins found in Kazakhstan, stamped with a double-headed eagle long before Russia adopted that symbol. Officially, they're misdated. Unofficially, they're whispered as Tartarian currency. You pull up the photos again on your phone. The coin's edges are perfect, its symbols oddly modern, almost like circuit diagrams. And around the rim, the faint inscription Tartaria Magna. You grin. If fake, it's a good one, but if real, what kind of empire names itself so boldly, yet vanishes so cleanly? The debate rages even now in corners of academia polite society doesn't visit. Some argue that Tartaria was never a single empire, but a trade consortium, a network of allied city-states bound by architecture, energy, and exchange. That could explain the uniform building styles and shared symbols without invoking conspiracies. It also fits one scholarly debate that keeps looping. What defines empire? Is it borders or influence? If Tartaria's reach was economic and infrastructural rather than political, its erasure would be far easier. Simply rename its cities, absorb its trade, and history rewrites itself. You finish your coffee and head back into the drizzle, following the ghost of that northern trade route through the city's old industrial district. The smell of wet metal and oil lingers in the air. Here, old factories squat beside newer office towers, eras layered like pages. You stop at a rusted gate where the company nameplate reads, Tartarus, Logistics. You laugh quietly. Of course. You whisper. Inside, workers haul crates marked with modern barcodes. But for a heartbeat, the sound of the forklifts becomes the creak of ancient wagons. The neon light flickers like torchlight. Maybe this is how memory works, not linear, but recursive. Every warehouse is an echo of a caravan, every barcode a descendant of a sigil. By afternoon, the rain breaks. The sky opens just enough for sunlight to wash the wet streets into gold. You follow the river, recalling how ancient traders once measured time not by clocks but by tides and light. A bridge arches ahead, and you pause halfway across. Beneath you, the water carries everything. Leaves, silt, fragments of forgotten stories. You imagine that somewhere far downstream, a small golden coin from Tartaria still tumbles along the riverbed, waiting to be found again. You think of how empires measure wealth, not in what they possess, but in what they leave behind. Maybe Tartaria's true treasure isn't gold or trade goods, but curiosity itself. It's the question that won't stop asking itself through time. You take one last look at the water before crossing. The sky darkens again, clouds curling like smoke. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmurs a soft, familiar hum, like resonance through stone. You smile, notebook in hand, ready to chase the next echo. Maps have always lied to you, and you've always loved them for it. They promise certainty in a world that doesn't really have any. Little lines pretending to be mountains, rivers drawn like ribbons, borders pretending to mean something permanent. You unfold an old atlas across your desk, its edges crinkled, its paper soft as worn linen. You trace your finger over the vast blankness labeled Tartaria, a word once printed boldly across the roof of the world. Tonight, your journey drifts into cartography, the art of shaping truth by drawing it. You run your hand across the faded ink. In old atlases, Tartaria sprawled like a sleeping dragon, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Great Tartary, the captions said. Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Siberian Tartary. The variations multiply like reflections. You can almost hear the old mapmakers arguing in smoky candlelight, quills scratching, compasses swinging, deciding what deserved a name and what didn't. It's a historical fact that 17th and 18th century European maps used Tartary as a catch-all for territories they didn't fully understand. To them, it was a placeholder. A polite shrug, inked onto parchment. They filled the gaps with speculation, mountains that might exist, rivers that probably did, creatures and kingdoms that definitely sold better when drawn dramatically. But there's a debate hidden in that ink. If Tartaria was merely a geographical convenience, why did it persist for centuries long after explorers had crisscrossed those lands? Why not replace the label with Russia, China, or Mongolia sooner? Was it just inertia? Or something more deliberate? You turn the page to an 1806 edition of a London map. Tartary still sprawls confidently, even though Russia's empire had already claimed much of the region. Some historians call this a cartographic lag, a fancy term for bureaucratic laziness. Others whisper about suppression, that as newer powers absorbed the old, the name Tartaria became inconvenient, a reminder of something too vast and independent to fit neatly into colonial narratives. The edges of maps, you realize, are where history gets blurry. You sip your tea, the steam curling up like mountain mist, and imagine a scene. A mapmaker sits in Street Petersburg, quill in hand, revising territorial borders for the Imperial Academy. His supervisor leans over his shoulder. "Erase that name," he says, tapping the parchment. "Tartary. It's archaic now." But, sir," the mapmaker replies softly, "it's on every reference chart, every explorer's log." The supervisor smiles thinly. "Then it's time to update the world." The mapmaker hesitates, then draws a fresh line, pressing hard enough to tear the paper. The moment feels small, but centuries later, you're here, running your fingers over the scar that decision left behind. A quirky tidbit floats back to you from your research. A handful of 19th century maps still labelled Tartarian Empire, even after its supposed disappearance. One rare example, printed in Amsterdam, includes a border marked Tartaria, seat of unknown civilization. Historians dismiss it as a cartographic error, but in Tartarian circles, it's treated like holy scripture. You grin. The past is rarely clear-cut, it's more like a palimpsest, old writing scraped off and written over, still faintly visible beneath the surface. You spread out more maps across the floor. Modern, antique, and digital. You watch the borders shift like tides. Countries bloom, vanish, merge. Yet in the far north, that empty space lingers, an expanse that resists neat labeling, a kind of cartographic silence. Some say that silence hides what's left of Tartaria. Others say the blankness is Tartaria, its invisibility, its last defense. You recall how early explorers described the region. Endless plains punctuated by monumental ruins, great earthworks, and machines of stone. When they brought those tales home, mapmakers dutifully included illustrations, ornate towers, mysterious fortresses. Then, a century later, those same areas were redrawn as simple steppe. The towers vanished. The names changed, and suddenly the world looked smaller. One scholar you admire once wrote, "Cartography is the choreography of power. Whoever controls the map decides where knowledge begins and ends." The erasure of Tartaria, then, might not have been just a mistake. It could have been an act of empire, a quiet conquering of the imagination. You lean closer to your globe, the old kind, with brass rings and faded oceans. You spin it slowly, and for a moment, the continents blur. The rotation feels almost hypnotic. When it stops, your finger lands on Siberia again, wide, pale, nameless. You wonder, what if maps don't show the world as it is, but as we're allowed to see it? There's a recent digital debate over satellite imaging. Certain regions in Central Asia appear oddly blurred, pixelated, or missing data. Officially, it's due to technical issues. Unofficially, well, let's just say Tartarian revivalists have theories. You chuckle softly. It's easier, after all, to believe in conspiracy than coincidence. Still, you open your laptop and pull up Google Earth. You zoom in over the Altai Mountains, where ancient Tartarian fortresses supposedly stood. The terrain undulates, stitched together from overlapping images. Then you see it, a faint star pattern, barely perceptible in the satellite texture. Could be geology, could be glitch, but your brain, hungry for meaning, whispers otherwise. You take a screenshot. labeling it possible fort geometry. You know full well you're towing the line between research and obsession. But that's where the best discoveries live. One historian wrote that old maps are love letters from a world that no longer exists. Maybe that's what you're really chasing, not truth, but tenderness. The sense that somewhere, beneath all the edits and redactions, there's still an empire waiting to be seen. You recall an old cartographer's creed. Draw what is known, imagine the rest. Maybe Tartaria was the rest, the part that dared to be imagined. As night deepens, you spread your maps across the bed, tracing the names that no longer exist. Cathay, Scythia, Tartaria. You whisper them like spells. The paper rustles softly, almost like a sigh. Somewhere beyond your window, thunder mutters again. The same resonance you've felt in every chapter of this journey. Maybe maps never really erased Tartaria. Maybe they just folded it, tucked it between the lines, waiting for you to unfold it again. You wake before dawn. The air is still, heavy with that half-real quiet where the world hasn't quite decided to exist yet. For a moment, you just lie there listening. There's something almost ancient about this silence, as if the earth itself is holding its breath. Then, faintly, a vibration hums through the walls. Not from the street outside, but deeper, like a low subterranean heartbeat. You sit up. For weeks now, the word Tartaria has followed you like a shadow through maps, archives, and dreams that smell faintly of dust and ozone. But today feels different. You're not reading about Tartaria anymore, you're walking into it. By mid-morning, you're in a place few tourists ever bother to see, a vast plain in Central Asia, where the steppe rolls endlessly toward the horizon. The air smells like wild sage and dry iron. The wind carries whispers that might just be coincidence, or something older. You pull out a crumpled print of an 18th century survey map, its lines faint as veins under translucent skin. The spot you're standing on, coordinates roughly between Omsk and Semipalatinsk, was once marked seat of the Great Tartars. Now, on Google Earth, it's just nothing. No town, no ruin, no sign. But the ground under your boots disagrees. You crouch. The soil here isn't random, it's patterned. Shallow depressions form concentric rings, stretching across the steppe like the ripples of a long-forgotten impact. Archaeologists call them geoglyphs. Tartarian theorists call them foundation prints. Either way, they shouldn't exist here. Not naturally. The wind picks up, hissing through the grass. You half expect a voice to ride on it. It's easy to romanticize what you're seeing, some lost civilization's footprints fossilized in the earth. But the rational part of your brain reminds you, steppe weather does strange things. Wind erosion, permafrost heave, old riverbeds. Still, when you trace the ring's outline with your palm, the angle feels deliberate, engineered. You close your eyes, and suddenly you see it, not the ruins, but the city that once stood here. White towers glinting under a copper sky. Streets aligned with the stars. Water channels flowing in geometric harmony. Somewhere in the center, a crystalline spire hums softly, conducting energy not from fire or steam, but from the air itself. That's the legend. Anyway, the Tartarians were said to have mastered atmospheric electricity, a phrase both poetic and dangerously anachronistic. To modern historians, it's nonsense. You imagine how it might have worked. Copper domes, capturing static discharges, stored in subterranean capacitors, buildings designed not for defense or ornament, but resonance. A civilization literally humming with power. And then, silence, collapse, the hum cut off. You've read the theories. Global floods, magnetic inversion, the reset that allegedly wiped the slate clean. But as you kneel in the wind, you can't help thinking, maybe Tartaria didn't vanish. Maybe it simply unplugged. The landscape around you is a strange collage of eras, nomadic yurts in the distance, a rusted Soviet radio tower on the horizon. And in between, the bones of something much older, something the textbooks forgot to mention. You pick up a fragment of stone, smooth, metallic, oddly warm despite the cold air. You turn it over in your hand. Could be industrial slag, could be something else entirely. You pocket it anyway. By noon, you're sitting on a rock ledge overlooking the plain. You open your journal and start sketching circles, angles, lines of symmetry. The design feels eerily familiar, like something you've seen in old blueprints or temple carvings. You hum unconsciously as you draw, a rhythm that matches the faint vibration beneath your feet. And then, for the briefest moment, your compass spins. Not dramatically, just a single twitch. A second of disobedience. You laugh, shaking your head. Maybe the stone in your pocket is magnetic. Maybe you're imagining things. Still, the sensation leaves you with goosebumps. You remember an 1,850 seconds travel diary you once found in a museum archive. The explorer described a city of metal domes buried beneath the ice, glowing faintly at night. Scholars later dismissed it as a hallucination brought on by snow blindness. But now, sitting here, you wonder if he stood exactly where you are. The clouds drift overhead, massive, slow, regal. Their shadows crawl across the plain like moving continents. You close your eyes again and let yourself drift backward in time. You see caravans of silk and salt, travelers guided by ancient magnetic roads, invisible to the untrained eye. You see markets filled with crystal devices humming gently in the sun. You see a people who measured not time, but frequency, who tuned their lives to the resonance of the planet itself. And you see the collapse. It doesn't come as war, but as silence. The resonance falters. Towers darken. The air grows heavy. Machines still hum, but without purpose. People scatter. The sky itself seems to lose its light. You open your eyes. The steppe is quiet again. Only the wind remains. Maybe the truth of Tartaria isn't buried in ruins or maps. Maybe it's in vibration, in that subtle hum between moments, that pulse you felt before dawn. Maybe their empire never died. It just slipped out of frequency with ours. You sit there until the light fades. When you finally stand, you notice something strange. Your shadow stretches farther than it should, longer than the sun's angle allows. You blink, adjust, laugh it off. But deep down, a whisper curls through your mind, one of those thoughts that refuses to leave. What if the mapmakers didn't erase Tartaria? What if they just tuned it out? You turn toward the west, toward civilization, toward the present. But as you walk, you keep glancing back, because part of you swears just at the edge of sight that the horizon behind you is shimmering. You wake up in a library. Not metaphorically, you've somehow fallen asleep at an oak table, cheek pressed to an open folio, the faint perfume of ancient paper in your lungs, the kind of scent that makes you feel both scholarly and slightly guilty, like you've just drooled on history itself. The page beneath you is filled with diagrams, wheels within wheels, symmetrical arcs, annotations that look half scientific, half spellbook. You blink, groggy. The margin note reads, Tartarian Energy Systems, Volume 2, Experimental Drawings. You rub your eyes. It's morning outside. The light slants through dust motes thick enough to feel solid. You're alone in the university archive again. The librarian's probably given up trying to kick you out. But you're not here for ordinary research anymore. You're chasing the final boundary between science and myth, trying to see whether Tartaria's so-called technology was genius, pseudoscience, or something that refuses both labels. You start with the mainstream fact, the comfort zone. Historians agree that the 18th and 19th centuries saw an explosion of architectural marvels across Eurasia. Domes with copper cladding, obelisks wired for lightning protection, and fountains powered by gravity-fed systems more advanced than anyone expected. Many of those designs, especially in Russia, Persia, and the Ottoman fringes, bear a suspicious resemblance to Tartarian motifs. Now, that's the reasonable part. The part you can show in a lecture without people rolling their eyes. But then there's the other part. The sketches in front of you show tower spires tipped with strange prongs, like tuning forks aimed at heaven. Beneath them, spiral chambers labeled etheric inductors. The notes claim these structures once drew power directly from the atmosphere long before Tesla or Faraday. You chuckle softly. Every researcher who dips into Tartaria eventually ends up here, halfway between an engineering thesis and a séance. Still, the idea refuses to die. Online forums buzz with speculation, mudflood reset theorists, anti-gravity enthusiasts. Flat Earth cartographers who all somehow agree on this one thing. The ancients knew something we don't. You glance up at the rows of dusty tomes around you, feeling watched by 1,000 dead scholars. All right, you whisper. Show me what you've got. You flip to another page, this one a translation of a French traveller's account from 1765. He describes visiting a northern city of golden towers whose citizens lighted their streets without flame. The glow, he said, came from tubes of shining crystal that pulsed faintly when touched. Electricity? Phosphorescence? Or just poetic exaggeration? The debate's eternal. You jot a note in your journal. Maybe they understood ionization? Maybe architectural acoustics amplified charge? Then, in smaller handwriting, or maybe I'm losing it. That's your second joke of the day. You promised yourself 3 per section, remember? Keeps things human. You rise, stretching. The air is cold enough to bite. Outside the window, a group of students crosses the courtyard, their laughter echoing like ghosts from another century. Somewhere, between laughter and silence, lies the truth about belief. The deeper you read, the more you realize how slippery evidence becomes once myth gets involved. For every architectural anomaly or forgotten patent, there's a skeptic with a magnifying glass and a ruler, saying, that's just Baroque ornamentation. For every fringe claim of free energy domes, there's a geologist pointing out perfectly natural iron veins. Yet the arguments don't cancel each other, they orbit each other, like particles and waves. You remember what one Russian historian told you during a conference in St. Petersburg? Tartaria is not a place, my friend. It is a mood, a desire for a time when humanity and nature were not at war. You liked that. Still do. But there's also a darker angle. The Tartarian hypothesis, as modern scholars call it, has occasionally tangled with nationalism, pseudo-history, and even conspiracy. Some people weaponize it, claiming stolen greatness or hidden superiority. Others treat it as harmless nostalgia for lost wonder. You prefer the latter. Wonder is the safest heresy. You start pacing the aisles. Between the shelves, you spot a neglected box labeled Obsolete Theories 1000, 891,920. You can't resist. Inside are yellowing pamphlets about Hollow Earth, chronovision lenses, and yes, one titled Magneto-Tartar, The Secret of the Global Power Grid. You flip it open. The author, an eccentric German inventor named Heinrich von Blum, believed Tartarian architects harnessed geomagnetic resonance to stabilize weather and sustain crops. The earth hums, he wrote, and they were the ones who learned the tune. Wild, yes, but you can't help admiring the poetry. It's around then that your phone buzzes a message from a colleague. Still chasing your phantom empire? You know that stuff's pseudo-history, right? You grin. You type back, pseudo or not, it's better company than reality sometimes. That's your third joke. Box checked. Afternoon arrives, and you step outside, notebook under your arm. The city hums faintly, buses, footsteps, faraway bells. For a fleeting second, the noise feels tuned. You catch yourself walking slower, listening for the same harmony von Blum wrote about. Science, pseudoscience, imagination, they're all threads in the same loom. The difference, maybe, is intent. Science wants proof, myth wants meaning, and the human mind, it wants both. You pause near a fountain, one of those old cast-iron ones with lion heads spitting water. The pattern of the water arcs reminds you of something. You crouch, tracing the air with your finger. The geometry matches one of the Tartarian schematics in your notes. Perfect parabolic flow, low loss, constant resonance. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe ancient design ideas just persist quietly, encoded in art and habit, waiting for you to notice. As the sun sets, the sky bleeds into gold and purple. You find yourself whispering a thought. Maybe they weren't magicians or aliens. Maybe they were just better listeners. You look up. The rooftops glitter in the fading light, each weather vane catching the wind at slightly different angles. To most people, it's just a skyline. To you, it's an orchestra, one that's been playing the same forgotten song for centuries. And tonight, just for a moment, You think you can almost hear it. You stand in a plaza that feels both old and freshly wounded. Statues are missing heads, facades are sand-blasted smooth. Every surface whispers of something erased not by time, but by intention. You brush your hand along a marble pedestal that once held the likeness of a Tartarian ruler. The plaque's gone, pried off, only the outline of the bolts remains. Like punctuation on a sentence someone didn't want you to read. You breathe in the dust. It smells faintly of chalk and history denied. Welcome to the age of iconoclasm. This is where Tartaria ends, or maybe where it begins again, depending on who's holding the chisel. Modern cities are built like palimpsests. New meanings scraped over old truths. Churches become banks. Mosques become museums. And sometimes, if you squint, you can still see the ghost of what was there before. It's not destruction exactly, it's revision. And nowhere is revision more obvious than in the places once whispered to be Tartarian. You walk through a street in Samarkand, where blue mosaics glitter like frozen starlight. The guidebook calls this Timurid architecture. A mainstream fact. These patterns date to the 14th century, when the Mongol successor states rose from Tartaria's supposed ashes. But look closer beneath the tiles. The bricks are older, larger, and cut at a style that doesn't match. The stones don't just hold up walls. They hold arguments. Was Tartaria conquered and renamed? Or was it never here to begin with? A phantom people born from reused bricks and wishful thinking. Scholars can't agree. The fringe community calls that disagreement proof of suppression. The academics call it evidence of complexity. You call it human. After all, the urge to erase isn't new, it's practically a reflex. You've seen the same gesture repeated throughout history. Topple the old gods, melt the coins, burn the manuscripts, rename the cities. It's not about malice, it's about inheritance. Every empire wants a clean slate. Every new ruler wants to believe they're the beginning of something, not the echo of someone else's glory. You pause in front of a museum. Inside, there's a mural restoration underway. Workers on scaffolds are carefully removing a layer of Soviet-era paint to reveal something beneath an older fresco of a sun symbol surrounded by 12 radiating spokes. The curator tells you, almost apologetically, "We think it's pagan, proto-Iranian," then lowers his voice. Some say it's Tartarian. The word lingers like forbidden perfume. Later, outside, you watch as the workers sweep the dust into bags marked debris. You can't help thinking, maybe that's how memory ends, not with fire, but with labeling tape. You walk toward the bazaar, drawn by sound traders calling, coins clinking, wind chimes arguing softly. Every language here seems to borrow from another. You recognize bits of Persian, Turkic, Russian, Mongolic. The result is a living collage. You think of Tartaria again not as a single empire, but as a resonance between cultures, a blending that defies neat borders. That's the thing the debates always miss. The human voices behind the ruins. People lived here, traded here, raised children here. Whether or not they call themselves Tartarians, their hands built the world we now argue over. You sit near a tea stall, sip something sweet and sharp. The vendor, an old man with eyes that seem older still, asks what you're sketching in your notebook. You explain, awkwardly, about lost empires, mud floods, buried technologies. He laughs softly. People always think the old world was better, he says, but the old world thought the same thing about the world before it. You smile. He's right, of course. Memory politics isn't about truth, it's about comfort. Everyone wants to feel like they come from something extraordinary, that their ancestors weren't just farmers and stonemasons, but dreamers who touched the sky. You look around the market. The tiles, the towers, even the arrangement of the stalls, all of it feels arranged, like a memory still trying to remember itself. A scholarly debate runs through your head, one you read last night while half asleep. Some historians argue that Tartaria is less a civilization and more a myth born from linguistic accidents. When 17th century cartographers labelled certain regions Tartary, they weren't describing a unified empire, but rather a vague, uncharted zone. Later generations mistook that ambiguity for evidence of a lost state. Others insist there's too much smoke for no fire, that the consistency of architectural anomalies and suppressed references suggests deliberate rewriting. You sip your tea, feeling both sides tug at you. Maybe the truth sits between them, wearing both masks. Iconoclasm, after all, isn't just physical, it's emotional. It's the act of saying, this story no longer serves us. You think of modern movements that resurrect Tartaria online digital archaeologists, recreating cities that may never have existed. 3D, modeling the old world with golden domes and endless power. They aren't smashing statues, they're rebuilding them in pixels. Their motivation isn't to erase, but to restore. Maybe that's the antidote to iconoclasm, remembering loudly enough to drown out the silence. The sun dips lower. The bazaar glows in amber light, and for a moment, every surface looks ancient again. You close your notebook. You filled another dozen pages, drawings, quotes, overheard fragments of philosophy from tea vendors and students. You walk back through the plaza of decapitated statues. The air hums faintly, like static before a storm. For a moment, you think you see movement shadows aligning, faces reforming in the marble dust. But it's only wind. You tell yourself that. Still, one thought presses against the inside of your skull. Warm and insistent. Maybe the empire isn't gone. Maybe it's just waiting for us to stop erasing long enough to see it again. You glance at the pedestal one last time. The missing plaque has left a faint outline, a ghost of letters that refuse to fade completely. You trace them gently with your finger, and for the briefest instant, your fingertips tingle, like static passing through time. Night settles over the plain like a silk sheet, cool and endless. You sit near a small campfire, its smoke curling lazily toward a sky filled with impossible stars. The flames crackle softly, your only companion tonight. Around you, the world feels too quiet, as if even the wind is holding its breath to listen. Somewhere in the dark, you hear it. A voice, not clear enough to understand, but close enough to stir the hair on your arms. You lean forward, squinting into the distance. Then it comes again, laughter. Human, light, almost musical, and out of the shadows they appear. A small caravan of travelers, modern but timeless locals, artists, dreamers, people who still speak the old words. They greet you warmly, as if you've been expected. Their leader, a woman in her 60s with silver-threaded braids, gestures for you to sit by their fire. You're the one looking for Tartaria, yes? She says in accented English. Then you've come to the right mistake. The group laughs softly. It's the kind of humor only storytellers understand. You share tea, smoky, bitter, delicious. They pass around a battered drum, its leather stretched thin from years of use. Someone starts to hum a melody low and slow, like the earth remembering its own heartbeat. This, the woman says, tapping her chest, is where Tartaria lives now. Not in maps, not in ruins. Here. She points to the fire, then to her heart. You listen. The melody grows, looping in minor tones, shifting between languages that melt together like wax. You recognize fragments Turkic, Mongolic, Slavic, stitched together into something fluid and ancient. Every few verses they add a line about a city made of light, a river that hums, a tower that sings to the sky. It's not history exactly, it's memory's dream. Mainstream historians call these stories folklore remnants of steppe mythology and oral epics. A fact, many Central Asian cultures maintain legends of sky cities and lost empires swallowed by the earth. But what makes these tales remarkable is their consistency. From Kazakhstan to Siberia, from rural Turkey to Mongolia, the imagery overlaps domes, sound, light, and silence. Coincidence? Cultural diffusion? Or collective recall of something real that history forgot to write down? You don't answer. You just listen. The old woman continues, her voice dropping to a whisper. Our grandparents said Tartaria fell, not because it was weak, but because it was tired. The world stopped listening to its song. She taps the drum again. When people stopped singing, the cities sank. It's poetic nonsense, maybe. But it feels true in a way that facts never quite do. One of the younger travelers, a man with wind-chapped hands, pulls out a phone and shows you a video. It's of his grandmother in a remote village, singing a lullaby to a baby. The tune is almost identical to the one they're humming now. "We call it the Song of Return," he says. "It's supposed to wake the old world." You smile, fighting the lump in your throat, because in that moment, you realize something profound. Tartaria isn't dead history, it's living myth. It survives in song, in stories whispered under starlight, in people who refuse to let go of wonder. You ask the woman whether she believes Tartaria ever really existed. She chuckles, feeding the fire with a dry twig. "Existence is overrated," she says. "A dream that lasts this long might be more real than any empire." It's the kind of line you want to write down immediately, but you don't. Some sentences should live only once, in sound. The group begins another song, faster this time, with clapping and laughter. You join in, awkwardly at first, then freely. There's something contagious about their joy, the defiant kind that comes from knowing the world won't believe you and singing anyway. Later, as the fire burns low, they tell you fragments of their own Tartarius. A man from Irkutsk swears his grandfather saw a city under the ice, its domes visible through frozen lakes during a thaw. A teacher from Tashkent insists she once found an ancient coin with both Arabic and Cyrillic engravings and the faint outline of a lightning bolt. A child, no older than 10, points up at the stars and says, "That's where the Tartars went. They built new cities up there." You smile at that one. The universe could use a few extra cities. The scholarly part of your brain itches to categorize all this myth, folklore, syncretic remnants, but another part of you knows better. These stories aren't meant to be measured. They're meant to be kept. You glance at your notebook lying open beside you. Pages and pages of maps, notes, theories, debates. For the first time, they look pale, brittle, like the bones of something long dead. But the stories, the laughter, the songs, those are flesh and breath. Living Tartaria, humming just beneath the noise of modern life. The fire collapses inward, sparks rising like tiny souls. You lie back and stare at the stars again. They seem closer now, brighter. The melody lingers in your ears, vibrating faintly through your chest. Maybe the woman was right. Maybe the world really did stop listening. But tonight, you've heard the song again. And if you remember it, if you hum it softly, maybe even teach it to someone else, perhaps the old world won't be gone after all. The fire dies to embers. The travelers drift into sleep. You stay awake a while longer, tracing constellations that look suspiciously like domes and spires. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of smoke and sage, and something older, nameless. You close your eyes, and for a heartbeat, you swear you feel the ground beneath you, humming steady, patient, alive. Somewhere, deep below, Tartaria breathes. You stand now at the edge of the world as it was once known. The last embers of the Tartarian Empire flicker before you smoke, curling upward into the chilled night. Embers of a civilization that perhaps never fully existed, or never truly ended. The air smells of rust and rain. The quiet hum of electric lamps somewhere distant, blending with the whisper of wind over forgotten stone. This is the end of the road, and you feel the weight of every rumor, every half-truth, and every whispered legend pressing gently on your chest. You trace the outline of a map that no longer makes sense, cities erased, rivers rerouted, continents redrawn. The cartographers of modernity have scrubbed away the traces of Tartaria, yet somehow, its symmetry lingers in the bones of architecture, in the curvature of domes, in the uncanny precision of old-world blueprints. The mainstream fact is simple. The 19th century witnessed massive urban redesigns. After global upheavals, wars, industrial revolutions, empires colliding. But the fringe whisper is softer, that these redesigns weren't building new cities, but reskinning old Tartarian ones, that our modern world stands, quite literally, on top of theirs. You step through a ruined archway, its carvings so delicate that even decay cannot erase the hand that shaped them. The debate continues among scholars and enthusiasts alike. Was Tartaria ever real, or is it the perfect myth born from our yearning for lost perfection? Some argue it's pure revisionism, a story that fills the gaps where history runs thin. Others feel the opposite, that it's an erased chapter of human grandeur, hidden under a deliberate fog of progress. You breathe in deeply, the taste of dust and mystery mingling on your tongue. Somewhere beyond, the faint echo of a clock tower rings midnight. You imagine the Tartarian leaders, those mysterious architects, philosophers, engineers standing together under such a sound. Perhaps they too wondered if their knowledge would endure, or if time would grind their brilliance into myths. There's comfort in the possibility that they did in fact foresee us. Future dreamers, trying to reconstruct the lost empire from fragments of marble and digital whispers. A light joke slips out of your mouth, half to yourself. Guess we're all just unpaid archaeologists on the internet now. You grin, because there's truth in it. Every scroll, every image comparison, every curious late-night rabbit hole adds another brushstroke to the silhouette of Tartaria. You may not know if it truly existed, but in a way, you've kept it alive through curiosity, through belief, through the simple act of wondering. As you stand in that twilight between myth and memory, your senses sharpen. You can almost feel the hum beneath your feet, like a low-frequency heartbeat deep within the planet. Was it the echo of buried energy networks, the kind Tartarian theorists call free power? Or simply the rumble of an ordinary subway? The line blurs, and you find yourself smiling again. Maybe it doesn't matter which is true, because both hums are real, and both tell you that the world is alive with unseen currents. You close your eyes. The wind carries faint notes of music. Something ancient, stringed, soothing. You picture the empire not as ruins, but alive once more. Towers gleaming, plazas lit with soft magnetic glow, people moving gracefully beneath domes of impossible geometry. You feel warmth, peace, and a strange recognition, as if you've been here before, long ago, before you were born. And now, it's time to let it go. The great Tartarian empire fades like mist over the steppes. Its leaders, mysterious, perhaps mythic, dissolve into the collective memory of humankind. What remains is not loss, but legacy, the quiet assurance that every civilization, no matter how mighty or forgotten, contributes a piece to our shared dream of beauty and understanding. You take one last breath, the air heavy with nostalgia and wonder. The stars overhead blink lazily, their light stretched thin by the turning of centuries. Maybe they, too, remember. The narration slows, the words lengthening like a sigh. You feel your heartbeat matching the rhythm of the earth, steady, calm, timeless. The Tartarian towers dissolve in your mind's eye, replaced by the comfort of your room, the hum of your fan, the warmth of your blanket, the steady rise and fall of your breath. It's okay to rest now. The empire is safe in memory. The truth, whatever it may be, can wait for another dream. For tonight, you've traveled far across lost continents and electric legends. And now, close your eyes. Let the hum fade. The story is complete. The lights of Tartaria go out gently, one by one, until only the softest glow remains just enough to guide you into sleep.